At dawn on July 1st, 1916, the sky above northern France trembled with thunder, not from storms, but from the roar of 1,500 British guns shaking the earth to its core. In the trenches below, young men stood shoulder to shoulder, hearts pounding beneath heavy packs, faces pale beneath steel helmets. They were told the enemy was already dead, that after a week of bombardment, they'd walk across no man's land and take the German line before breakfast. Many smiled. Many even joked. Some wrote quick letters home, promising to see their mothers again by evening. None of them knew they were stepping into the bloodiest day in British history. As the whistles blew, they climbed the ladders and rose into the gray morning light. Thousands of them, shoulder to shoulder, advancing in lines across a shattered landscape. Within minutes, machine guns began their terrible work. Whole battalions vanished before they crossed halfway. The air filled with dust, screams, and the crack of bullets tearing through hope itself. Men who had trained for months fell within seconds. Others stumbled forward, determined, desperate, unaware they were marching straight into history's most merciless slaughter. This was the Somme, a place where courage met catastrophe, where boys became legends, and generals gambled with the future of a nation. It was meant to be the great breakthrough, the beginning of the end of the war. Instead, it became a symbol of its madness, a battle that swallowed a generation and left behind silence, fields of mud, and the ghosts of those who never came home. Tonight, we go back to that moment, to the roar of the guns, the terror of the trenches, and the voices of men who faced the impossible. This is the story of the Battle of the Somme, told through British eyes, the hope, the horror, and the heartbreak of World War I's deadliest day. Chapter 1. The Road to the Somme. A Nation at War, 1914 to 1916. The smell of damp earth and gunpowder hung over northern France. A young British soldier crouched in a muddy trench, his uniform soaked through, his rifle heavy with grime. In the distance, the low rumble of artillery never stopped, a constant, dull thunder that had become as normal as breathing. Somewhere beyond the fog and wire, unseen enemies waited. 2 years earlier, this man might have been a shopkeeper, a postman, a schoolteacher. Now he was part of something far larger, a war that had already devoured millions. He didn't know it yet, but all roads, all orders, all dreams now led to one place, the Somme. When Britain entered the Great War in August of 1914, the nation was full of pride and certainty. Crowds cheered in London's Trafalgar Square as soldiers marched through the streets beneath Union Jacks. Newspapers promised the war would be over by Christmas. The British Expeditionary Force, small, professional, disciplined, was seen as the finest army in the world. They called it the Old Contemptibles, and it numbered barely 100,000 men. These were seasoned soldiers, trained for empire, not industrial slaughter. They fought their first battles at Mons and Le Cateau, where courage and discipline slowed the German advance. But soon, the tide of modern warfare revealed itself. By late 1914, Europe's fields had become scars of mud and wire. The First Battle of Ypres turned green pastures into graveyards. Machine guns, once experimental, became instruments of mass death. The British held their ground, but at a terrible cost. Those who survived returned home changed, faces pale, eyes hollow. The reality of modern war had arrived. There would be no quick victory, no glorious charge, no home by Christmas. Through the freezing winter that followed, the front solidified into trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, a vast wound cutting across Europe. Men lived like moles beneath the earth, surrounded by rats, lice, and the smell of decay. When the rain came, the trenches filled like ditches. Boots rotted, bodies sank into the mud, and every movement meant risk. The Western Front had become a stalemate, where neither side could advance without losing tens of thousands of lives. In London, the government faced a grim truth. The British Empire, vast and powerful, had entered a new kind of war, one not of maneuver, but of endurance. For the generals, this meant adaptation. For ordinary people, It meant sacrifice. Across Britain, factories thundered day and night, producing shells, rifles, and uniforms. Women took the places of men in mills and workshops, their hands stained with oil and cordite. Trains rolled endlessly to the ports, carrying food, ammunition, and the growing army of volunteers who had answered Lord Kitchener's call. The famous poster of the mustached field marshal pointing a finger and declaring, "Your country needs you." They came in droves: miners, clerks, farmers, and students. Entire football teams enlisted together. In places like Manchester, Leeds, and Glasgow, groups of friends joined as one unit, forming what became known as the Pals Battalions. They believed in loyalty, in friendship, in doing their part. Few understood what awaited them. Their laughter and songs echoed through training camps from Salisbury Plain to Aldershot, where wooden rifles were replaced by the real thing, and idealism gave way to discipline. But on the continent, the war was changing shape. In 1915, the British launched limited offensives at Neuve Chapelle, Aubers Ridge, and Loos. Each was meant to test tactics, to feel for weakness in the German lines. The artillery thundered for days, the infantry surged forward, and the price was always the same: thousands of casualties for a few yards of ground. Still, the generals learned. Every failure revealed something: how to coordinate guns and infantry, how to cut wire more effectively, how to maintain supply under fire. Britain was learning how to fight a modern war, but at a cost written in blood. By early 1916, the situation grew desperate. To the south, the French army was under siege of Verdun, where the Germans had launched a massive assault designed to bleed France white. Month after month, the French held on, but their strength was fading. They begged their British allies to strike elsewhere, to draw German divisions away from Verdun, to relieve the unbearable pressure. General Haig, newly appointed commander of the British Expeditionary Force, faced an impossible decision. His men were untested in large-scale battle. His artillery was growing but still limited. Yet if Britain did not act, France might collapse. The plan that would lead to the Somme was born out of necessity, not ambition. Haig was a complex man, disciplined, proud, and deeply religious. He believed in duty above all else, and he was convinced that the British spirit could prevail where others faltered. Working alongside General Henry Rawlinson, he crafted the idea of a great summer offensive along the River Somme. The goal was simple in words, but colossal in scale: to break through the German lines, link with the French advancing from the south, and restore movement to a war frozen in mud. It was to be the big push, the hammer blow that would shatter the enemy's grip. But beneath the optimism, doubts ran deep. The Germans had spent 2 years fortifying their positions with concrete bunkers, deep dugouts, and interlocking machine gun nests. Their trenches were not shallow ditches, but subterranean fortresses. The British, by contrast, were still finding their footing. Many officers came from civilian life, promoted after a few months of training. The men beneath them were brave, but inexperienced. They believed that courage in numbers could succeed where technology had failed. Meanwhile, back home, Britain was changing. The streets of London were darker now, quieted by rationing and grief. Casualty lists appeared daily in the newspapers. Every town had someone missing. Mothers wore black, wives clutched telegrams. And yet, amid the sorrow, there was unity, a shared belief that this suffering meant something, that it would one day end the war to end all wars. Factories turned out shells in the millions. Railways carried ammunition day and night to the Channel ports. In the training grounds of England, Scotland, and Wales, men rehearsed the coming assault. They learned to march across open fields in perfect lines, shoulder to shoulder. It was a strategy based on confidence in artillery, that the enemy would be obliterated before the infantry even arrived. Generals believed that the week-long bombardment would wipe out German resistance entirely. For the men preparing to go over the top, this sounded reassuring. But the reality on the ground was far more complex. Artillery fire could destroy the surface of the trenches, but not the deep shelters beneath. The Germans had learned to survive bombardments, emerging with their machine guns the moment the shelling stopped. This deadly truth was not yet understood by the British planners. They trusted in the weight of firepower, in mathematics over experience. And so the stage was set for a disaster disguised as destiny. In France, the Somme itself seemed peaceful that spring. The river wound through gentle valleys lined with wheat fields and poppies. Villages like Albert, Fricourt, and La Boisselle still stood, though scarred by earlier fighting. Locals tended their land as shells whistled miles away. The calm before the storm was almost cruel, a quiet landscape soon to be turned into a wasteland of craters and bones. For the British soldiers arriving in the region, the journey felt like the edge of adventure. They marched through narrow roads lined with cheering French children, past ruined churches and fields dotted with artillery positions. In their letters home, they described the beauty of the countryside, the kindness of the locals, and their excitement for the coming battle. Few imagined that these letters would be their last. The High Command prepared meticulously. Maps were drawn, supply routes laid out, hospitals established miles behind the front. In headquarters, officers spoke in measured tones about objectives, sectors, and phases. It sounded clinical, almost mechanical. Yet on the ground, the reality would be chaos. The clash of human frailty against industrial might. Kitchener's new army was no longer new. By 1916, it numbered in the millions. Men who had never seen a battlefield now filled the ranks of the largest army Britain had ever assembled. They were volunteers, not conscripts, driven by pride, loyalty, and the belief that they were fighting for civilization itself. Their uniforms were still stiff with new fabric, their boots fresh from the factory floor. In photographs, they smiled. They had no reason not to. Meanwhile, far above them, in rooms lit by lamplight, generals studied reports from Verdun. The French were barely holding on. Every day they sent desperate pleas for relief. If Britain delayed, Verdun might fall, and with it, the heart of France. The Allies agreed. The offensive must begin in the summer, no later than July. The chosen site, the Somme, was not ideal terrain. It lacked the open ground of Flanders or the strong logistical lines of Arras. But it was where British and French forces met, and that made it symbolic. This would be the place where the Allies would strike together. By June, everything was in motion. The countryside echoed with the rumble of guns and the grind of supply wagons. Thousands of tons of shells were stockpiled. Artillery pieces were lined up wheel to wheel along the ridges. The soldiers practiced climbing out of trenches, advancing through barbed wire, and signaling with whistles. They rehearsed their roles like actors before opening night. And in a way, that's what it was, a performance written in orders, staged in mud, directed by men who believed this time would be different. In the final days before the offensive, Haig walked the front lines. He was calm, almost serene. He spoke softly to his officers, urging confidence, reminding them that this was the moment Britain would prove its strength. Behind him, the guns waited, over 1,400 of them, ready to unleash the most intense bombardment in human history. Soldiers whispered that nothing could survive it. They were certain that this was the end of the stalemate, that victory was finally at hand. But deep beneath the earth, in the darkness of the German dugouts, men waited. They knew the shelling would come, as it always did. They trusted in their engineers, their shelters, their discipline. The storm would pass, and when it did, they would be ready. As June faded into July, the British soldiers received their final briefings. They packed their kits, cleaned their rifles, and wrote their last letters. Some prayed. Others simply stared into the horizon, listening to the endless rumble of guns that shook the ground day and night. The air smelled of smoke and rain. The sky was low and gray. Everything was ready. And so Britain, once a nation of peace and pride, stood on the edge of its greatest trial. The men of the new army were about to enter a world no one could truly imagine, a world where courage would meet catastrophe, and history would be written in fire. The guns were ready. The maps were drawn. The orders signed. The Somme waited. Chapter 2. the plan, Haig, Rawlinson, and the promise of victory. The thunder of guns had not yet begun, but the storm was already brewing behind the lines. Across the quiet fields of northern France, the hum of preparation filled the air, the clatter of horseshoes on cobblestones, the whine of trucks, the hammering of engineers laying miles of duckboards through the mud. This was not chaos, it was purpose. Everything, every shell, every map, every whispered order, pointed toward one date. July the 1st, 1916, the day the British Army would launch the greatest attack in its history. At the heart of this plan stood two men, General Sir Douglas Haig and General Sir Henry Rawlinson. Haig was the commander-in-chief of the British Expeditionary Force, a tall, reserved man with an almost unshakable sense of destiny. He believed in discipline, in divine guidance, and in the ultimate triumph of moral courage over material might. To his subordinates, he appeared distant, cold perhaps, but his confidence was infectious. Britain needed men like him, calm in the face of uncertainty, unwavering amid disaster. Rawlinson, his subordinate, was more practical, analytical, and cautious. Where Haig saw vision, Rawlinson saw logistics. Together, they would design the operation that would define not only the war, but the century. Their relationship was complex. Haig had faith in the big idea, the grand breakthrough that could end the war in one mighty blow. Rawlinson, commanding the Fourth Army, believed in limited, achievable objectives. Capture the first enemy trench, consolidate, then push again. He feared the consequences of overreach. But Haig wanted more than progress. He wanted a turning point, a blow that would shatter the German front and bring the war back to movement. For nearly 2 years, both sides had been locked in a deadly stalemate. Now, under pressure from their French allies, Haig promised to deliver the offensive that would relieve Verdun and bring the Allies closer to victory. Planning began in December of 1915. The chosen sector was the Somme, a stretch of front line along the river Somme and Picardy. It was not selected for its terrain or strategic value, but because it was where the British and French armies met. Joint cooperation was essential. Originally, the offensive was to be a French-led assault, with British forces playing a supporting role. But the slaughter of Verdun had drained French manpower and munitions, forcing the British to take the lead. The balance shifted. What had been intended as a secondary action now became the main effort of the Allied summer campaign. In Haig's headquarters, optimism reigned. He believed that Britain's expanding industrial power, its growing artillery, its mass of new volunteers, and its mechanized logistics would finally turn the tide. The plan was simple in theory, yet monumental in execution. For 7 full days, the British artillery would pound the German positions with over 1.5 million shells. Every known trench, every wire obstacle, every machine gun nest would be targeted. When the bombardment ended, the German defenses would be pulverized, their morale shattered. Then, at precisely 7:30 on the morning of July 1st, British infantry would go over the top, advance across no man's land, and occupy what was left of the enemy's front line. To the men writing the orders, it seemed almost certain. How could anything survive such firepower? Haig envisioned a rolling advance, 10 miles deep, leading to open ground where cavalry divisions could sweep forward and exploit the breakthrough. It would be the return of movement, the death of trench warfare. He called it the Great Push. But beneath the confidence, cracks were forming. The artillery was the key, yet the artillery was flawed. Britain's industry had exploded since 1914, but quality had not always kept pace with quantity. Thousands of shells were defective, filled with shrapnel instead of high explosive. Shrapnel shells were deadly against men in the open, but almost useless against wire or bunkers. Many of the fuses were unreliable. Some failed to detonate at all. The deeper German dugouts, reinforced with timber and concrete, could withstand even the heaviest bombardment. In some sectors, the Germans had dug 40 feet down, their tunnels linked by underground corridors and hidden exits. When the guns began, they would simply wait. Haig and Rawlinson were not ignorant of these risks, but they had faith in numbers. They believed that even if the bombardment was imperfect, the sheer volume of fire would overwhelm the enemy. Nearly 1,400 heavy guns and howitzers were assembled along the front, a logistical feat unlike anything Britain had ever attempted. Ammunition trains ran day and night from the channel ports to the gun lines. Whole hillsides disappeared beneath dumps of shells, neatly stacked like bricks. Every target was plotted, every barrage scheduled to the minute. The mathematics of war had replaced its poetry. As the generals planned, the soldiers prepared. The men of Kitchener's new army, drawn from every corner of Britain, trained endlessly for the assault. They learned to climb ladders, to move in lines, to advance through smoke. They were told that resistance would be light, that the enemy trenches would be empty or full of the dead. Many believed it. Their officers did too. The very concept of a creeping barrage, artillery fire moving forward just ahead of the infantry, was still new and untested. Communication between guns and troops was unreliable, often depending on runners or flares. Yet in training camps across France, confidence grew. The men were eager to prove themselves. The human side of the preparations was staggering. Behind the lines, villages became military towns. Barns filled with shells, fields lined with tents, roads clogged with ammunition columns. Engineers built railways, water lines, and medical stations. Cooks fed thousands. Doctors inspected endless ranks of recruits. The smell of oil, sweat, and wet canvas filled the air. Even the local French farmers, long accustomed to the war's presence, marveled at the scale of it all. The British Army, once small and expeditionary, was now a machine of unimaginable size. Haig spent his evenings reviewing maps in silence, occasionally glancing toward the horizon where flashes of distant artillery lit the sky. His staff recorded his quiet confidence in their diaries. He believed that the Germans were weakening, that their morale was cracking under the weight of Verdun. Intelligence reports suggested that many divisions had been transferred south, leaving the Somme sector thinly held. It was, he thought, the perfect opportunity. Yet intelligence in 1916 was as much guesswork as science. The German lines were deeper than any British officer imagined. Rawlinson, more pragmatic, worried about the scale of the objectives. He argued that the attack should focus on capturing the 1st and 2nd German trench lines, consolidating them before pushing forward. But Haig wanted more. He pressed for an immediate breakthrough, a rolling advance toward Bapaume, the rail hub behind the enemy's defenses. He believed that the key to success lay in momentum, never giving the Germans time to recover. The disagreement between theory and caution would echo through every decision made in the weeks ahead. Far from the headquarters, in the trenches, the men sensed something coming. The activity along the front increased daily. New artillery pieces arriving under cover of night, long columns of wagons bringing ammunition, and endless digging to prepare assembly trenches. The sound of hammering and the faint glow of lanterns filled the darkness. Soldiers joked about the big push, but beneath the laughter was anxiety. Everyone knew it would be something enormous, something unlike anything before. Letters home carried strange hints. "We've been busy," they wrote, "and soon it'll be our turn." For the French, the Somme offensive was both a relief and a gamble. General Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, pressed Haig to begin as soon as possible. Every day, the slaughter at Verdun grew worse. French divisions were being bled dry. Joffre believed the British attack would force the Germans to divert forces north, easing the strain. To him, the Somme was not about breakthrough. It was about survival. For Haig, it was about proving Britain's strength and taking leadership of the Allied effort. Each saw the same battle through different eyes. By early June, Haig and Rawlinson toured the front. They visited the trenches opposite the German line, spoke with battalion commanders, and examined captured prisoners. Everywhere they went, the men cheered them. Morale was high. Belief in the plan was absolute. Rawlinson, however, noticed details others ignored. the thick belts of barbed wire still intact, the unbroken lines of enemy trenches visible through field glasses, and the signs of movement in the German rear. He reported his concerns, but the momentum of the plan was unstoppable. The guns were already in place. The shells were ready. The date was set. In the final weeks of June, the weather turned gray and humid. Rain slicked the trenches and soaked the gun crews. Still, preparations continued. The first test firings began, single rounds, then short bursts, shaking the ground for miles around. Farmers' barns collapsed under the shock. Birds vanished from the sky. Civilians in nearby towns pressed their hands to their ears as the bombardments began in earnest. It was a noise that seemed to come from the end of the world. Behind every gun, men labored in shifts, hauling shells as heavy as anvils, wiping sweat and grease from their faces. The acrid smell of cordite filled the air. Each shell carried the hope of victory, or the illusion of it. When the bombardment finally began on June 24th, it was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Haig believed the sound alone would break the German spirit. He was half right. In his diary, Haig wrote of calm determination and faith. "The enemy's morale is sinking," he noted. "The moment is ripe for decisive action." But some of his staff felt unease. They had heard reports from reconnaissance pilots describing German trenches still intact. They had seen photographs showing wire that remained uncut. Haig dismissed such doubts as pessimism. The plan, he insisted, must proceed. For the soldiers waiting in the forward trenches, life became a blur of noise and anticipation. The ground trembled day and night. Men shouted over the roar, slept fitfully beneath flickering lamps, and prayed the shells would do their work. Rats fled the trembling earth, and even the air seemed to vibrate. Those who had fought at Loos or Neuve-Chapelle said they had never heard anything like it. The German defenders endured it in silence. Hidden deep in their dugouts, they listened as the world above them exploded. For days, they waited, coughing through dust and smoke, ears ringing from the concussions. They emerged only at night to repair damage, knowing the attack would come soon. "We knew it was the beginning of something terrible," one German soldier later wrote. "But we also knew we would survive the shelling. We always did." Back in British lines, officers read their final briefings. The objectives were laid out in meticulous detail. Capture the first trench line, then the second, advance to the village of Pozières, then push toward Bapaume. Cavalry would be held in reserve to exploit the breakthrough. Signalers prepared miles of telephone wire, runners memorized routes, and medics stocked bandages and morphine. Everything had been considered, except the human cost. As June drew to its close, the men grew restless. Some carved their names into their rifles. Others wrote in diaries or stared silently across no man's land, trying to see through the smoke. They knew the order could come any day. When it did, there would be no more waiting. The storm would break, and history would begin again in fire and blood. In the quiet hours before the guns opened, a thin mist settled over the fields. From Haig's headquarters, the horizon looked peaceful, almost serene. But beneath that calm, the machinery of destruction was ready. 1,400 guns, over 1 million shells, hundreds of thousands of men. The plan was perfect on paper, elegant in theory, and catastrophic in practice. As Haig reviewed his maps one last time, he whispered to his aide, "The hour is nearly upon us. God grant us victory." Then he turned away, unaware that the plan he believed would end the war would instead mark the beginning of Britain's greatest tragedy. The guns were waiting, the infantry were ready, and the morning of July 1st crept closer with every breath. The promise of victory had been made. Now, it only remained to be tested, in blood, in mud, and in the unrelenting fire of the Somme. Chapter 3. The Battlefield, the Somme River, and the German Line. Before the first shell fell, the Somme was still a place of quiet beauty. The river wound like a silver ribbon through the French countryside, cutting through gentle valleys and small villages with names that would soon become etched into the heart of British history. Albert, Thiepval, Fricourt, La Boisselle, Beaumont Hamel. The wheat fields rolled softly toward the horizon, dotted with red poppies and the sound of birdsong drifting on the wind. To anyone passing through in early 1916, it seemed untouched by the violence that raged further south of Verdun. But that calm was deceptive. Beneath those fields, beneath that quiet earth, lay the bones of 2 years of war. The trenches, the tunnels, the scars that no one could yet see. The Somme was about to become the stage for the greatest slaughter of the Great War. As the British troops moved into position, they saw the signs of that hidden war everywhere. Roads torn to shreds by wagon wheels, shell holes filled with rainwater, villages half collapsed and reeking of smoke. The smell of the front hung thick in the air, cordite, wet earth, and rot. They could taste the war before they even reached the trenches. Men trudged through narrow communication ditches carved deep into the chalk soil, walls reinforced with timber and sandbags. Each step squelched in mud mixed with the remains of past battles. It was here, along this river, that Britain's new army would make its stand. The Somme front stretched for roughly 25 miles, divided between the British and the French sectors. The British held the northern two-thirds, from Gaumecourt in the north to Maricourt near the river, while the French took the southern third, where the terrain dipped toward the Somme Valley. The land itself was deceptive, soft rolling hills, open fields, no mountain or forest to favor defense. It looked like ground that could be taken. But beneath its surface, the Germans had built a fortress. The German army had occupied this region since late 1914. They had chosen their positions carefully, favoring the high ground. Their engineers, some of the best in the world, spent nearly 2 years turning the landscape into a masterpiece of defensive warfare. Their front line was not a simple trench. It was a network. Deep, interconnected systems ran back for miles, each layer supporting the one behind it. The front trench, often 20 or 30 feet deep, was built with concrete revetments and wooden beams. Behind it lay communication trenches, machine gun emplacements, and dugouts sunk into the earth, some so deep that soldiers joked they could survive the end of the world. The Germans called it the Siegfriedstellung, the strong position, though the British simply referred to it as the German line. Between the opposing trenches lay no man's land, a wasteland of shell holes, shattered trees, and barbed wire thicker than a forest hedge. In some places, the wire stretched for 30 yards across, layers upon layers of sharp steel. In daylight, it glinted like frost. At night, it was a black, silent barrier of death. The British artillery was meant to cut through it before the infantry advanced. But even in peacetime, cutting such wire would take hours with proper tools. To expect it to vanish under bombardment was an act of faith more than certainty. Beyond the front line lay 2 more, the second and third positions, equally strong, connected by reserve trenches, observation posts, and hidden artillery pits. The Germans had spent the winter reinforcing them with concrete bunkers, each large enough to hold an entire platoon. Inside, soldiers slept on wooden bunks, safe from shell fire, their rifles stacked neatly by the door. When the bombardment began, they would wait it out in silence, playing cards or writing letters, until the shelling stopped. Then, when the enemy infantry appeared on the skyline, they would climb the steps, set up their machine guns, and begin their work. The British intelligence reports described these defenses in detail, but few in command understood their depth. To the ordinary soldier, the German line was just another trench, dangerous but conquerable. The reality was something else entirely. The Germans had perfected the art of survival. Each strong point was placed to provide overlapping fields of fire. Machine guns were hidden in shell holes, in barns, in church ruins. Snipers positioned themselves in trees or in the shattered remains of chimneys. Every inch of the Somme front was a trap, and every trench was a killing ground. In contrast, the British lines were newer, hastily dug, and often shallow. The chalk soil of Picardy made digging difficult. The walls crumbled under rain, and duckboards were swallowed by mud. The men lived ankle-deep in filth, the constant dampness rotting their boots and skin. Rats thrived, feeding on discarded food, and the bodies buried just beneath the surface. When night fell, the sound of gnawing and squeaking echoed through the darkness. Yet despite it all, morale remained high. The men had faith in their commanders, in the promise that the coming bombardment would sweep the enemy away. In the weeks before the attack, the landscape changed daily. The once quiet ridges filled with guns. Heavy howitzers, field pieces, and massive naval cannons were dragged into position under cover of night. Ammunition dumps grew like mountains beside the roads. Engineers built observation towers from which officers could watch the enemy lines through telescopes. The smell of gun oil and horse manure hung over the camps. Every field, every hedgerow, every farmhouse became part of the war machine. The village of Albert, once a charming French town, became the nerve center of the British sector. Its church steeple, or what remained of it, loomed over the landscape, topped by a golden statue of the Virgin Mary holding the infant Christ. The statue had been hit by a shell and now hung precariously, bent forward at a right angle, as if bowing toward the earth. The soldiers called it the Leaning Virgin and swore that when it finally fell, the war would end. Until then, it stood as both an omen and a symbol, a silent witness to what was coming. From Albert, roads radiated toward the front, toward Ovelers, Connelmaison, Fricourt, and the others. Along these roads, convoys of wagons, ambulances, and artillery rolled day and night. Drivers cursed and whipped their mules through the mud, while infantry columns trudged by in endless lines, faces streaked with sweat and dust. The closer they got to the front, the louder the guns became, a low, steady growl that never ceased. By the time they reached their assembly trenches, the noise was constant, a living thing that vibrated through the bones. The Somme was divided into sectors, each assigned to different corps and divisions. To the north, the British Fourth Army under Rawlinson held the main effort. To the south, the French Sixth Army prepared to attack alongside them, their artillery heavier and their experience far greater. The cooperation between the two allies was uneasy but necessary. French officers looked skeptically at the young British units, many of whom had never seen a major battle. The British, in turn, admired the professionalism of the French artillery, but bristled at their condescension. Still, they shared one goal: to break the German front wide open. For the men waiting in the forward trenches, the enemy seemed distant and unreal. They could see the German lines through periscopes or from observation posts, a faint line of sandbags and shattered trees across the horizon. Occasionally, rifle fire cracked through the air or a sniper's bullet hissed past, but most of the time the front was eerily quiet. At night, flares lit the sky like fireworks, revealing the jagged landscape in brief flashes of white. The men smoked, whispered, and stared into the darkness. Somewhere out there, they knew, the enemy was doing the same. The British engineers had been busy below ground as well. Across the Somme front, tunneling companies worked in silence, digging beneath no man's land to plant vast mines under the German strongpoints. The miners, many of them former coal workers from Wales and northern England, dug through clay and chalk, their lamps flickering in the stale air. They could hear the Germans digging too, sometimes only a few yards away. It was a deadly game of patience and sound, where one misplaced strike of a pickaxe could give everything away. By late June, 19 huge mines had been completed, each packed with tons of explosives. When detonated, they would tear open the earth itself. Above ground, the transformation continued. The once green countryside was now a gray wasteland. Every tree had been stripped bare by shell fire. Craters overlapped like the surface of the moon. Barbed wire stretched across every field, and the air stank of chemicals and decay. Yet amid the destruction, there was a strange order, a sense that all of this ruin was leading toward something. The men talked about the coming assault as if it were a test they had to pass, a storm they had to endure. Some wrote letters home with cheerful words they didn't quite believe. Others fell silent, lost in thought. When dawn came, the mist rose from the river, curling over the ridges like breath. The artillerymen stood by their guns, waiting for the signal. Infantry crowded in the trenches, checking their rifles, adjusting their packs. The officers paced quietly, glancing at their watches. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. They could see the German lines faintly through the haze, still and quiet, unaware, or so they thought. The Somme, once peaceful and green, now waited for fire. From his command post, Haig surveyed the landscape through field glasses. He saw the lines of guns stretching to the horizon, the endless supply trains moving forward, the mass of humanity preparing for battle. He believed he was witnessing the dawn of a new kind of war, one in which industrial power and discipline would triumph over brute defense. "The army is ready," he said quietly to an aide. "The men are eager. This will be our great success." Rawlinson was less certain. He visited the front lines himself, speaking to officers and men. He saw their optimism, their readiness, their faith. But he also saw the uncut wire, the intact trenches, the untouched strongpoints on the ridges. He sent reports back to Haig, warning that the bombardment might not be as effective as expected. Haig acknowledged them politely, but the plan continued unchanged. The date was fixed. The shells were already falling. There was no turning back now. In the German positions opposite, life carried on with grim normality. Soldiers read the Bible by candlelight, boiled coffee on small stoves, and listened to the rumble of distant guns. Their commanders, experienced veterans of Verdun, were not alarmed. They had endured bombardments before. They knew that once the shelling stopped, the British would come, and when they did, they would be met with fire. Night fell again over the Somme. The stars flickered faintly above the smoke. The trenches were filled with whispers, prayers, and the soft clink of metal as men cleaned their rifles. Somewhere in the darkness, a soldier murmured, "Tomorrow it begins." The word passed down the line, from mouth to mouth, until it reached the last man crouched in the mud. Tomorrow. The Somme River flowed quietly through the valley, reflecting the faint light of the moon. The fields that had once promised harvest now promised only death. The German line waited in silence, deep and strong, while the British army, young and full of faith, prepared to throw itself against it. Between them lay a strip of land barely a few hundred yards wide, no man's land, a graveyard in waiting. And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the guns prepared to speak, and the Somme, that quiet, ancient river, prepared to drown the world in fire. Chapter 4. The Bombardment. 7 Days of Thunder. June 24th to 30th, 1916. The dawn of June 24th, 1916, broke with a strange, electric stillness across the Somme. A light mist hung over the fields, soft and golden, as if the earth itself had not yet realized what was about to begin. Then, at precisely 6 in the morning, the stillness shattered. From horizon to horizon, the ground erupted. Over 1,400 British guns opened fire in unison, shaking the sky and the soil alike. The air itself seemed to tear apart. Birds vanished. The wind stopped. And for the soldiers standing in the trenches, the world became nothing but sound, a thunder so deep it was felt in the chest before it was heard in the ears. The Battle of the Somme had begun not with men charging forward, but with the voice of industry, the voice of vengeance, the voice of Britain's might unleashed at last. The bombardment was meant to be unstoppable, precise, and devastating. For 7 days, the British artillery would pound the German line without pause. More than 1.5 million shells would fall on their positions, obliterating trenches, cutting barbed wire, and burying machine gun nests under mountains of debris. At least, that was the plan. To the men firing the guns, it felt like the entire world had become an engine of destruction. The smell of cordite choked the air. Gun crews worked in relentless rhythm. Load, fire, recoil, repeat, until their shoulders ached and their hands bled. Each shell whistled through the sky with a long, haunting scream before striking home, sending up fountains of dirt, smoke, and fire. In the forward trenches, British soldiers watched in awe. From their vantage points, the German line across no man's land disappeared beneath a wall of dust and smoke. It was impossible to imagine anything living could survive beneath it. Men cheered each explosion as if it were a victory in itself. Some danced on the fire steps, shouting, "That's done them in." Others stood silently, transfixed by the apocalyptic display. They could feel the ground tremble with every detonation. The earth shook like a living thing, groaning under the weight of war. For the generals, this was the heart of the strategy, a demonstration of overwhelming power that would, they believed, make the coming infantry assault almost effortless. General Haig wrote in his diary that the bombardment was most satisfactory. He was convinced that no German trench could withstand such punishment. Reports from observation balloons described the enemy lines as shattered and lifeless. The myth began to take hold, that the enemy had been destroyed. But the truth was hidden beneath the smoke, deep underground, where German soldiers sat in bunkers 40 feet below the surface, alive, waiting, listening. In the German dugouts, the world above was chaos. Shells fell in waves, high explosive, shrapnel, and gas. The air was thick with dust, choking the lungs, and every impact sent showers of earth and rock cascading down the steps. Yet the shelters held. Engineers had built them for exactly this purpose, reinforced with timber and concrete, some even equipped with electricity and telephone lines. When the bombardment began, the soldiers took shelter, sealed the hatches, and waited in the darkness. They smoked, sang softly, or stared in silence while the earth convulsed overhead. For them, it was like living through the end of the world, but it was also familiar. They had survived bombardments before, and they knew that when the shelling stopped, the real danger would begin. Back in the British lines, the 7-day barrage became part of the men's existence. They lived by its rhythm, the pounding thunder, the brief pauses, the resumption of fire. Sleep was impossible. Even miles behind the front, the noise was constant, a low rumble that rattled windows and shook the walls of farmhouses. Horses bolted. Men shouted to be heard, even when standing inches apart. The sound carried all the way to Paris and London, where faint tremors were reported by those listening for news from the front. The Somme had become the loudest place on earth. During those days, the landscape changed beyond recognition. The gentle fields of Picardy became a smoking desert. Trees vanished. Villages that had stood for centuries were reduced to piles of rubble. The ground was littered with shell cases and torn wire, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burning. From observation balloons high above, British officers reported satisfaction. The German line appeared obliterated. The trenches collapsed, the parapets flattened. But photographs told only half the story. Beneath that surface destruction, the German fortifications remained intact, untouched by the shrapnel shells that exploded harmlessly above them. The British artillery was powerful but flawed. Many of the guns were old, their barrels worn thin from overuse. The ammunition supply, though vast, was uneven in quality. Some shells exploded too early, others failed to detonate at all. The most critical mistake lay in the choice of ammunition itself. Shrapnel shells, designed to kill men in the open, were used in overwhelming numbers, over 60% of the total. They burst high in the air, scattering lethal fragments, but they did little against deep bunkers or wire entanglements. The German barbed wire, meant to be shredded by the bombardment, often remained untouched, lying in twisted heaps that looked destroyed but were still impassable. It was a deadly illusion that no one would discover until it was far too late. For the soldiers waiting in the trenches, the bombardment was both terrifying and comforting. Each explosion was a promise of safety, proof that the enemy was being destroyed. They believed what they were told, that the German defenses were being reduced to dust, that the survivors, if any, would be too shocked to resist. Letters written home during those days spoke of excitement, even eagerness. "We'll walk across, and it'll be over in an hour," one private wrote to his sister. The Hun can't live through this. Yet there were signs that all was not as it seemed. Some patrols sent out at night reported hearing movement from the German lines. Machine gun fire still answered occasionally from across the waste of no man's land. Officers noted that wire entanglements, when glimpsed through binoculars, seemed oddly untouched. These warnings reached headquarters, but by then the plan had grown too large to stop. Haig and Rawlinson had committed everything, the guns, the shells, the lives, to this strategy. The momentum of war had become unstoppable. On June 26th, a British officer named Lieutenant George Copped watched the bombardment from a forward trench near the village of Carnoy. The din was deafening, he later recalled. We thought no living creature could exist through that. But as he scanned the enemy lines through his periscope, he saw flashes, faint but unmistakable, the muzzled bursts of German guns firing back. "They're still alive," he whispered to himself, but his voice was lost in the roar. The Germans, for their part, were not passive victims. Despite the constant shelling, their artillery remained active, firing counterbarges onto British positions. Their observers, hidden in ruined villages and behind ridges, tracked the flashes of British guns and reported their locations. The German counterfire was accurate and deadly. Some British batteries were hit directly, their crews wiped out in seconds. Others suffered chain explosions when ammunition dumps were struck, sending black plumes of smoke spiraling into the sky. It was a reminder that the enemy, though battered, was not broken. As the days passed, the weather turned foul. Rain fell in steady sheets, turning the trenches into rivers of mud. Gun crews worked in water up to their ankles, their uniforms soaked, their faces streaked with soot. The shells kept coming, one after another, hour after hour, day after day. Some soldiers went nearly mad from the noise. Men broke down crying without knowing why. Others sat staring into space, their ears bleeding, their minds numb. The constant vibration made it impossible to think, to rest, or even to eat. Food arrived cold, soaked in mud. Sleep, when it came, was filled with dreams of explosions. By June 28th, the bombardment had become the single defining sound of the Western Front. Pilots of the Royal Flying Corps flew above the lines, directing artillery fire by wireless, mapping the enemy trenches in smoke and shadow. From their fragile biplanes, they saw patterns invisible to the men below, the craters overlapping like scales, the black scars of the German lines stretching away to the horizon. They reported hits on key positions, ammunition dumps, and crossroads. Haig was pleased. Everything seemed to be working according to plan. But in the German shelters, officers were calmly taking notes. They recorded the rhythm of the British guns, their calibers, their targets. They knew exactly when the shelling intensified, when it slackened, and when it shifted to new sectors. They could predict the British routine almost to the minute. The deeper dugouts, built far beyond the reach of shrapnel, remained secure. When the time came, the men would climb out, man their positions, and unleash hell. The night of June 29th was among the most violent of all. The bombardment reached its peak. Every gun fired without pause. The sky pulsed with flashes, illuminating the landscape like a storm at sea. Even the clouds seemed to glow from within, lit by the fire below. From miles away, civilians could see the horizon flicker red. The earth trembled as if it were alive. One French farmer wrote in his diary, "We thought the world was ending." And yet, amid all this destruction, the Germans endured. They repaired wire, rebuilt trenches, and prepared their machine guns. The officers issued extra ammunition and rations. They knew what was coming. The British could not fire forever. At some point, the guns would stop, and when they did, the infantry would come. On June 30th, the final day of the bombardment, the British soldiers were told the assault would begin the next morning. The excitement was palpable. In the trenches, men cleaned their rifles, checked their bayonets, and packed their kits. Officers briefed their platoons, going over maps and objectives by candlelight. Many soldiers wrote letters home, sealing them in envelopes marked "to be sent if I fall." The tone of those letters was calm, even cheerful. They believed victory was assured. They had seen the enemy line disappear under the storm. How could anyone survive it? At midnight, the guns paused briefly, only to resume with renewed fury at dawn. The final barrage was the heaviest yet. The air was thick with smoke and dust. The horizon was a wall of flame. Then, at precisely 7 minutes past 7 on the morning of July 1st, a signal flare went up. The mining engineers pressed the detonators, and the earth itself erupted. Massive explosions tore open the German line. At Hawthorne Ridge, one of the largest mines went off, sending a column of earth and fire nearly 400 feet into the air. The shock wave could be felt miles away. Men in the British trenches cheered, believing it marked the end of the enemy. The bombardment had done its job, or so they thought. But across no man's land, inside the smoke and ruin, the German soldiers began to emerge from their shelters. Their faces were gray with dust, their ears ringing, their uniforms torn, but they were alive. They climbed the steps to their firing positions, set up their machine guns, and aimed toward the British lines. The storm had passed. The killing was about to begin. As the whistles blew along the British front, thousands of men prepared to go over the top. They adjusted their packs, tightened their chin straps, and waited for the order. Behind them, the guns fell silent for the first time in a week. The silence was deafening. After 7 days of thunder, the quiet felt wrong, a pause that hung in the air like a held breath. Then the officers raised their pistols, and the men began to climb. The Somme battlefield, once a peaceful valley of rivers and farms, now stood on the edge of an abyss. For 7 days, Britain had thrown its might against the enemy, believing that sheer power could break the stalemate. But as the sun rose over the shattered land, the truth would be revealed in the most brutal way imaginable. The bombardment had not destroyed the German line. It had only awakened it. And when the men of the new army stepped into no man's land that morning, they were walking into the guns of an enemy that had survived the storm. The thunder had ended. The silence had returned. And in that silence, the bloodiest day in British history was waiting. Chapter 5. The first day, July 1st, 1916, Britain's bloodiest day. Dawn broke cold and pale over the Somme on the 1st of July, 1916. A thin mist clung to the ground, coiling in the shell holes and drifting along the shattered ridges. The rain from the previous night had stopped, leaving the trenches slick with mud and the air heavy with smoke. For the soldiers crouched in their firing bays, the world felt frozen in time. They had been waiting for this moment for weeks, training, rehearsing, believing. They had watched the bombardment turn the horizon into flame, heard the thunder of guns that never seemed to end, and now, after 7 days of constant fire, the silence was almost unbearable. The guns had stopped at last, and in that silence, every man knew the hour had come. At 7:28 in the morning, 2 minutes before the attack, the ground trembled as mines detonated beneath the German lines. The largest, at Hawthorne Ridge near Beaumont-Hamel, tore a crater 130 feet wide and 60 feet deep, hurling earth, fire, and bodies high into the sky. The explosion lit up the entire front, a fiery wound in the landscape. Men miles away felt the shock wave ripple through their boots. It was the signal, the breath before the storm. In the British trenches, officers raised their whistles to their lips. Men tightened their chin straps, adjusted their bayonets, and fixed their eyes on the ladders ahead. Some whispered prayers. Others laughed nervously, shaking hands with their friends. The clock ticked down the final seconds. At 7:30, the whistles blew. From one end of the British line to the other, thousands of men began to climb. They moved in waves, steady, disciplined, each battalion advancing in long lines across the churned-up earth of no man's land. The early light caught their helmets and rifles, making them shimmer like silver. Some carried footballs, others carried the flags of their regiments. For months they had trained for this moment, taught that slow and steady was the key, that the enemy ahead was broken, that resistance would be weak. They stepped forward believing the worst was already behind them. It was not. Across the fields, In the German trenches, the survivors of the bombardment had emerged from their deep dugouts minutes earlier. Their faces were gray with dust, their ears still ringing, but their weapons were ready. They had manned their machine guns, checked their sights, and peered through the smoke toward the British line. The sight before them was almost unreal. Waves of soldiers walking calmly across open ground. For a brief moment, even the Germans hesitated, thinking it must be a trick. Then the officers shouted orders, and the guns opened fire. The sound was like tearing cloth, a rip in the world itself. The first bursts of machine gun fire swept through the British ranks, cutting men down in clumps. The front line staggered, but the survivors kept moving. More fire came, relentless, unbroken. Whole sections vanished. Men dropped silently where they stood, some still clutching their rifles upright as they fell. The air filled with dust and the whine of bullets, the sharp crack of rifles, and the screams of the wounded. Those behind saw the men ahead collapse and stepped forward to fill the gap, just as they had been trained. The order was to advance, and advance they did, through the smoke, through the noise, into death. The PALS battalions suffered first and worst. These were men who had enlisted together, friends, neighbors, co-workers, and now they fell together. The 11th East Lancashire, known as the Accrington PALS, advanced near Sarah. Within minutes, nearly the entire unit was wiped out. The 1st Newfoundland Regiment went over the top near Beaumont Hamel, and by 8 o'clock, it had ceased to exist as a fighting force. In the south, near Montauban, the 30th Division met less resistance, their artillery having done its work, but along most of the front, the story was the same. Machine guns scything through men as if they were grass. From his observation post, General Rawlinson watched the assault through binoculars. At first, he saw the lines moving forward in perfect order. The plan seemed to be working. But soon, the dust cleared, and he saw that those lines were no longer moving. They were lying still. "They're not advancing," one of his aides murmured. Rawlinson said nothing. He knew. Across the fields, the British army was being cut to pieces. In the trenches behind the front, medical stations overflowed. The wounded staggered or crawled back from no man's land, faces pale, uniforms torn and bloody. Some had no legs, no arms, no words. The stretcher bearers worked until they collapsed, carrying men whose blood soaked through the canvas and dripped onto the ground. Horses screamed as shells burst near the supply lines. The roads filled with ambulances, wagons, and bodies. By mid-morning, chaos reigned. Orders were lost, communication lines cut, runners killed. But still the guns fired. Still, men climbed the ladders. The 8th Division attacked near Ovalers, advancing behind a creeping barrage that fell short, cutting down their own men. At Thiepval, the Ulster Division went forward under fire so intense it turned the ground to smoke. Yet they broke through, capturing the first German line before being driven back by counterattacks. Their courage became legend, but at a cost no legend could justify. In the north, the 36th Ulster Division took Schwaben Redoubt, only to be encircled and decimated. Everywhere, bravery collided with impossibility. For the men on the field, time lost meaning. They moved through a nightmare of smoke and noise, stumbling over craters, barbed wire, and the dead. The ground was uneven, torn apart by the very shells meant to protect them. When they reached the German wire, they found it uncut, a wall of steel untouched by the bombardment. Men threw themselves against it, hacking with wire cutters, smashing with rifle butts, clawing with bare hands. Bullets ripped through them as they worked. Those who made it through found the enemy trenches still intact, filled with soldiers ready to fight. The Germans, stunned at first by the scale of the attack, recovered quickly. Their machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Ammunition runners dashed through the trenches, feeding belts into the guns as fast as they could. Officers shouted, "Fewer free," and the air turned to lead. At La Boisselle, British troops tried again and again to take the German line, only to be driven back. At Mametz, they fought hand to hand in the ruins of the village. The smell of blood and cordite mixed with the stench of decay. By noon, the entire valley was one vast inferno of smoke and screams. From above, the Royal Flying Corps watched helplessly as the lines disintegrated. Pilots sent frantic reports to headquarters. Enemy positions intact. Our men suffering heavy casualties. But the chain of command was slow, clogged with confusion. Some officers, far behind the front, still believed the attack was succeeding. They sent orders to press forward, to reinforce the advance. And so, wave after wave went out into the storm. By midday, the heat was rising, the mist burned away by the sun. The wounded lay exposed under the glare, calling out for water, for medics, for their mothers. Some dragged themselves into shell holes, clutching their wounds. Others simply lay still, staring up at the sky. The sound of flies began to drown out the guns. In some places, the British gained a few hundred yards. In others, they gained nothing at all. The dream of a breakthrough had died before noon. Haig received the first casualty reports that afternoon. They were incomplete, confused, impossible to process. Heavy losses. One telegram read, "Enemy positions hold firm." Haig frowned, then returned to his map. He still believed success was possible. "We must persevere," he told his staff. "This is the price of war." But those on the ground knew better. They saw the truth in the faces of the survivors who staggered back through the lines. They saw it in the empty ranks, the silence where voices had been. In the evening, as the sun dipped low, the guns fell quiet once more. The fields that had been green that morning were now black and red, littered with bodies. Some men were still alive, trapped in no man's land, calling weakly through the darkness. The medics tried to reach them, crawling through the mud under sniper fire, but many never made it back. The cries continued long into the night, growing fainter as the hours passed. When dawn came again, the true scale of the disaster became clear. Along the entire British front, nearly 60,000 men had been killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. 19,000 were dead. Whole battalions had ceased to exist. The dead lay in rows, their faces turned upward to the gray sky. The air was thick with the smell of blood and smoke. The survivors stood in stunned silence, unable to speak. Some wept openly. Others stared at nothing, their minds emptied by what they had seen. The generals called it a setback, a learning experience. They said the objectives would be taken tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that. But the men who had been there knew better. They had looked into the abyss and seen it looking back. They had seen courage become slaughter, faith become futility. The promise of the great breakthrough had turned to ruin in a matter of hours. And yet, even in that ruin, the British Army did not collapse. The survivors reorganized, reinforced, and prepared to fight again. Orders were issued to renew the assault, to press on. Haig refused to abandon the offensive. He believed that persistence would wear down the enemy, that attrition itself would lead to victory. The Somme would continue. The blood of the first day was only the beginning. That night, as the smoke settled and the stars appeared over the devastated land, the men who remained alive sat in their trenches, listening to the distant moans of the dying. They had learned the true face of modern war, and it was not glory or heroism. It was noise, chaos, and loss beyond imagination. They cleaned their rifles in silence, waiting for new orders. Somewhere down the line, a soldier whispered, "We've been through hell." Another voice answered, "Hell? This is only the start." Across the valley, the German soldiers, exhausted and shaken, tended to their wounded and buried their dead. Even they were horrified by what they had seen. The English came on like waves. One wrote in his diary, "They were brave, terribly brave, and we shot them down like harvest grain. We pitied them, but we could not stop." The 1st of July, 1916, was over, but its echoes would never fade. It was the day Britain lost its innocence, the day entire towns were emptied of their sons, the day hope itself seemed to die in the mud. The Somme had become a graveyard of youth, of optimism, of the belief that courage could conquer machine guns. And yet, the guns would roar again the next morning, and the soldiers would climb the ladders again, because that was the order. The battle was far from over. For Haig, for Britain, and for the men who still clung to the idea of victory, the Somme was not finished. It had only just begun. The first day had taken a generation, but the war demanded more. As night descended once more over the shattered ridges, the wind carried with it the faint sound of voices, some praying, some calling for help, others silent forever. The fields of the Somme lay still beneath the moonlight, littered with the dead of both armies. In that silence, a single truth lingered. The British Empire had come to the Somme to break the enemy, but it was Britain itself that was breaking. And by the time the battle was done, the world would never be the same again. Chapter 6. The Failure of the Plan. Haig's Shock and Realization. The morning after the 1st of July was gray and quiet, the kind of silence that feels wrong after so much noise. Smoke still hung over the valley, thick as fog, and the once green ridges were now only black shapes against the pale sky. Crows circled lazily above the fields where the dead lay in uncountable numbers. Along the British lines, the survivors stood motionless, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. The attack that was meant to change the course of the war had left nothing but ruin. The greatest offensive in British history had collapsed in a single day, and yet, at that hour, few at headquarters truly understood what had happened. The reports were incomplete, the scale of the disaster still hidden by confusion and disbelief. But soon, the truth would arrive, carried by messengers with trembling hands and voices that could barely speak. General Douglas Haig woke early that morning, confident that success had been achieved somewhere along the line. In his diary, he wrote optimistically, "The attack has been carried out with much vigor." He believed the heavy casualties were the price of progress, that breakthroughs would come once reserves were pushed forward. To him, the Somme offensive was still alive, still capable of achieving its purpose. But as the day wore on, the reports grew darker, more chaotic. Battalion after battalion had been destroyed. Communications were gone. The front line, meant to surge forward miles into enemy territory, had barely moved at all. By noon, the optimism in Haig's headquarters had begun to fade. The scale of the failure became clearer with every passing hour. Messages arrived written in blood, scribbled on torn scraps of paper by exhausted officers. "We are pinned down by machine gun fire. Casualties heavy. Awaiting reinforcements. Cannot advance." Each report carried the same grim story. Units had vanished, communications were severed, and in many places, no survivors remained to send word at all. The telephone lines that connected divisions to corps and corps to Army command were cut by shell fire. Couriers who tried to cross the battlefield were killed before they made it halfway. Haig sat at his map table, surrounded by silence, staring at a front line that refused to move. At his side, General Rawlinson tried to piece together what had gone wrong. His instincts had told him this might happen. He had warned Haig that the artillery bombardment might not have destroyed the German defenses. Now, the proof was written in blood across the Somme Valley. But Rawlinson said little. Haig was his superior, and to question him now would do nothing for the men still fighting. Instead, he ordered new assaults, hoping to salvage some kind of success from the wreckage. For the soldiers on the ground, there was no illusion left. They knew. They had seen the machine guns, the uncut wire, the German trenches still intact. They had watched entire companies vanish under fire. The smell of death hung thick in the air, gunpowder, blood, and decay blending into something that would never wash off. The wounded called out from no man's land, their voices faint, echoing across the valley long into the night. "Help, water, mother." The cries came and went with the wind. The stretcher-bearers worked through the darkness, crawling through mud and wire, searching by the light of flares for anyone still alive. But for most, there was nothing to find. At dawn on the 2nd of July, the living began to collect the dead. They worked silently, dragging bodies into shell holes, covering them with tarpaulins, or simply leaving them where they fell. Faces once familiar were now unrecognizable. Men moved through the fields with expressions as cold as the morning air, their boots squelching through blood-soaked earth. It was like walking through hell, one survivor wrote. Only there was no devil, just the silence of men who had seen too much. When the casualty figures reached headquarters, even the clerks refused to believe them. Nearly 60,000 losses in one day. 19,000 dead. It was the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army. The numbers made no sense to men who had grown up believing in the discipline and courage of their soldiers. Haig stared at the figures for a long time, then simply said, "This cannot be accurate." But it was. The lines of names stretched endlessly. The PALS battalions, the regulars, the volunteers, all gone. The flower of Britain's youth lay in the fields of the Somme. Still, Haig did not call off the offensive. He refused to see it as defeat. In his mind, the battle could still achieve its goal, to wear down the German army through attrition. The logic was brutal but simple. If both sides suffered equally, the Allies could endure longer. Britain and France had the manpower, the industry, the resources. Germany did not. Every yard gained, Haig told his staff, is a nail in the coffin of the enemy. To him, the Somme was no longer about victory in the traditional sense. It had become a machine of grinding destruction, and he intended to keep it turning. Rawlinson was less certain. His men were exhausted, demoralized, and decimated. The ground gained was minimal, in some places only a few hundred yards. He suggested pausing the offensive, regrouping, and preparing for a new strategy. Haig refused. The French of Verdun were still under immense pressure, and Haig had promised Joffre he would keep the Germans occupied. To stop now, he argued, would betray the entire Allied cause. The battle would continue, whatever the cost. That cost began to rise with every passing day. New assaults were ordered on the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th of July, each with diminishing returns. The British artillery, low on shells, resumed its bombardments, but the effect was the same as before: thunderous noise, little destruction. The infantry advanced once more into a wall of fire. Rain turned the battlefield into a swamp. The trenches filled with water, the wounded drowned where they lay. Yet the orders kept coming. Advance. Secure the objective. Hold the line. In London, the newspapers told a different story. The morning editions spoke of victory, of great progress along the Somme. British troops advance on broad front, one headline declared. Photographs of smiling soldiers were printed beside words like heroism and triumph. The reality was hidden, censored to protect morale. Families across Britain read those headlines and believed their sons were pushing forward, unaware that many of them were already lying in shallow graves. It would be weeks before the truth began to surface. In France, Haig visited the front personally, moving among the survivors, inspecting the trenches. He tried to speak to the men, but most simply stared at him in silence. They were polite, but the respect in their eyes was gone. They had done what was asked of them and been slaughtered for it. Haig could feel the weight of their gaze, but he buried it beneath his own sense of duty. "They have fought bravely," he said to his aides. "We must ensure their sacrifice is not in vain." Rawlinson met him later that evening. They spoke quietly, the candles flickering on the map table between them. "We must change our tactics," Rawlinson said. "This cannot go on." Haig nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He believed that the Germans, too, had suffered immense losses. Intelligence reports suggested their reserves were stretched thin. If he kept the pressure constant, eventually they would break. It was the logic of exhaustion, of blood against blood. "We have them where we want them," he said softly. "We must not relent." Behind the front, reinforcements began to arrive, fresh battalions of the new army, young men who had not seen the first day's horror. They were told little of what awaited them. Veterans tried to warn them in whispers, but the machine moved too fast for hesitation. Within days, they were sent forward to replace the fallen, to fight for positions already lost and retaken a dozen times. For them, the Somme was not a single battle, but a nightmare without end. By mid-July, the first rain of summer had turned to unrelenting storms. The ground became a sea of mud, swallowing men, horses, and equipment. The dead could no longer be buried. They lay half submerged in the trenches, their faces pale in the dim light. The stench was unbearable, rot, gas, and wet flesh mingling in the air. Yet the men endured. They worked, fought, and waited under constant bombardment. Shells fell day and night, bursting in the mud with a heavy, wet sound. It seemed there was no end to the noise, no moment of silence left in the world. Haig continued to believe that success was near. He spoke of wearing the enemy down, of steady progress. His staff began to adopt his language. The reports sent to London spoke of optimism, of lessons learned, of morale remaining high. But among the officers in the field, anger was growing. They saw the waste, the futility, the senseless repetition of attacks that achieved nothing. Some wrote letters home condemning the command. Others simply fell silent, numbed by what they had witnessed. At Gamacourt, where the diversionary attack had failed on the first day, the survivors were still collecting bodies 2 weeks later. In the north, near Serra, the trenches were clogged with corpses that no one dared to move. The smell was like poison, one man wrote. You could taste it when you breathe. Yet even in this desolation, the orders were clear: advance. Capture the next trench. Hold the ground. Every inch of land won was hailed as progress. Every handful of dirt bought with hundreds of lives. By late July, the Somme had become not a battle, but a ritual. Each morning, the guns opened fire. Each evening, the men went forward. The pattern never changed, only the names of the dead. The Germans, too, suffered terribly, but their defense held firm. Their lines bent, but they did not break. They adapted, shortening their barges, moving troops at night, conserving ammunition. The British continued to learn, but the lessons came slowly, written in blood. At headquarters, Haig began to sense the unease around him. His aides avoided his gaze. His subordinates obeyed, but without conviction. Still, he pressed on. He saw himself as a man carrying the burden of history, chosen to lead his nation through fire. War is never easy, he told one visitor, but we are fighting for civilization itself. The price must be paid. Those words, written in his diary that night, would become his creed. Rawlinson, meanwhile, saw the toll firsthand. He visited the hospitals, where rows of men lay bandaged and broken, their eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The moans echoed through the halls. Nurses worked until their hands shook. Outside, the wagons lined up, waiting to carry the newly wounded from the next assault. He returned to his command tent in silence. "We are killing the best of our nation," he said quietly to his adjutant, "and we call it progress." In the villages behind the lines, life continued in the shadow of death. Civilians returned to their ruined homes. Farmers tried to harvest what little remained of their fields, and children played in the mud beside soldiers who had seen too much. The war had become a part of the landscape, inseparable from the air and the earth. By the end of the first week of July, the reality could no longer be denied. The British had gained almost nothing. The German line was unbroken. The casualties were staggering. The offensive that was meant to break the stalemate had instead deepened it. And yet, orders came for another push, another bombardment, another day. The generals called it persistence. The men called it madness. Haig stood once more before his map, his hand resting on the area marked Thiepval. His eyes were cold but determined. "We have learned," he said to Rawlinson. "Next time, we will do better." But in truth, he was already trapped. The battle had taken on a life of its own. To stop now would be to admit defeat. And so, the Somme would continue, day after day, week after week, until there was nothing left to give. That night, the guns resumed their steady rhythm, echoing across the valley like the beating of a giant heart. The trenches glowed faintly under the flare-lit sky. The men prepared again to climb the ladders, to step once more into the killing fields. Haig believed he was fighting toward victory. In reality, he was marching deeper into the shadows of his own creation. The Somme had begun as a plan of promise, a vision of breakthrough, of courage conquering steel. Now it had become something else, a war within a war, a machine that fed on hope and returned only death. And as Haig sat in his tent, staring into the candlelight, he could not yet see that the battle he refused to abandon would soon become the symbol of everything that war could destroy. Not just men, but faith, trust, and the very idea that human will could master the storm it had unleashed. Chapter 7. The Battle Continues. July's Bloody Lessons. The 1st of July had ended in disaster, but the Battle of the Somme was far from over. The guns never truly stopped. Even as the cries of the wounded faded into silence, new bombardments began, new orders were issued, and fresh battalions were marched to the front. The men who arrived in early July stepped into a world already broken, a wasteland of churned mud, shattered trees, and the smell of decay hanging in the air like a curtain. The living moved among the dead without words. Flies covered everything. The sun beat down, turning the battlefield into a furnace. There was no escape from the heat, from the stench, or from the realization that this was only the beginning. Haig refused to call off the offensive. To him, the first day's slaughter was not a failure, but a grim necessity, the prelude to victory. He believed the German army had suffered as badly as the British, that its defenses were weakening. "We are wearing them down," he told his staff. "Persistence will bring success." He saw the Somme not as a single battle, but as a campaign of attrition, one that would grind the enemy to dust. And so the orders went out. Attack again. Press the advantage. Keep the pressure constant. For the men in the trenches, it felt like madness. The German lines still stood strong. Their machine guns still swept across the fields, and the barbed wires still gleamed beneath the sun. Every inch of ground was paid for with lives. Yet, day after day, the British artillery roared once more, and day after day, the infantry climbed from their trenches and walked into fire. The sound of shells became the rhythm of life. The smell of cordite replaced the scent of summer. Even the birds had gone. Only the whine of bullets and the rumble of guns remained. The first major assault after July 1st came on the 3rd, as British troops tried again to capture the villages of Fricourt and La Boisselle. The bombardment had torn the landscape to pieces, but the German defenders were still there, deep in their dugouts. When the shelling lifted, the British advanced, only to be met by the same wall of fire that had annihilated the first wave. At La Boisselle, they fought through mine craters so vast they seemed like new valleys carved into the earth. Men crawled along the edges, firing blindly into the smoke. The fighting was close, savage, and merciless, bayonets flashing, grenades exploding in confined spaces. It took 3 days to capture the ruins of the village, and when it was done, there was almost nothing left standing. Not a single wall remained unscarred, not a single street untouched. Haig saw these gains, a few hundred yards, a pile of rubble, and called them progress. The British line had advanced. The newspapers at home printed headlines of victory. British push forward on the Somme. To the families reading those words, it sounded hopeful, but for the men who fought there, hope was a fragile thing. The price of each headline was measured in thousands of dead. The reality was that every yard gained was soaked in blood. As the days passed, the lessons of the first day began to sink in. The British generals realized that their artillery had been too weak in places, their infantry too exposed, their tactics too rigid. The idea of walking across no man's land in perfect formation was abandoned. Now, smaller units began to move in waves, advancing from crater to crater, using shell holes as cover. Officers learned to coordinate with the guns, calling for creeping barges that would move just ahead of the infantry, providing a shield of fire. It was an improvement, but it came too slowly, and the cost of learning was measured in lives. The Battle of Bazenin Ridge in mid-July marked the first attempt to apply these lessons. The objective was to seize a ridge line overlooking the central Somme sector, a high ground that dominated the surrounding valleys. The attack began before dawn on July 14th, in darkness and silence, without the traditional long bombardment that had alerted the Germans before. When the artillery finally opened fire, It was sudden and precise. The infantry followed closely behind, advancing through the morning mist. For the first time, the British achieved real surprise. The Germans were caught off guard. By noon, parts of the ridge had fallen into British hands. It was a moment of hope. Soldiers who had seen nothing but failure felt, for the first time, that progress was possible. The 9th Scottish Division captured Longeville. The South Africans fought fiercely for Delville Wood, and the 7th Division stormed High Wood. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The Germans counterattacked with artillery and gas. Delville Wood became a nightmare of splintered trees and broken bodies. The men called it Devil's Wood, and for good reason. The fighting raged there for 6 days, with neither side willing to give an inch. When the South Africans were finally relieved, only 700 men out of 3,000 walked out alive. Haig took the ridge as proof that his strategy was working. He wrote to London that the enemy was thoroughly worn out. But in truth, the Germans were adapting faster than the British realized. They changed their tactics, abandoning the rigid defense of every trench. Instead, they created flexible defensive zones, allowing the British to occupy the first lines before counterattacking with reserves. It was a deadly innovation, one that turned every British gain into a trap. Men who celebrated taking a trench were often wiped out minutes later by machine guns from the flanks or shells from behind. The battle dragged on, relentless and merciless. Each day had its own name, its own killing ground. Contalmaison, Pozieres, Longeville, Guillemot. The pattern repeated endlessly. The guns opened fire, the infantry advanced, the Germans counterattacked, and the lines barely moved. The British soldiers joked bitterly that they were fighting for the next 5 yards. They had come to France to win glory. Now they fought to stay alive. The summer heat grew unbearable. The air over the battlefield shimmered with dust and flies. The stench of death was everywhere, sweet and heavy, mixed with the sharp tang of cordite and rotting flesh. The dead could not be buried. They lay where they fell, swollen in the sun. Rats grew fat on the corpses, bold enough to crawl over sleeping men at night. In some sectors, the ground itself seemed alive, crawling and buzzing with decay. The smell was the worst, one soldier wrote. You could taste it, even when you close your mouth. And yet, through this horror, life continued. The soldiers built new trenches, repaired the old ones, cooked meals on makeshift stoves, and wrote letters home. They joked about the lice, about the mud, about the officers who never seemed to know what they were doing. Humor was the only defense left. But beneath the jokes was exhaustion, and beneath that, a quiet, unspoken despair. They had seen too much, and they knew too well what tomorrow would bring. Haig visited the front again in late July. He toured the captured ground, escorted by staff officers who spoke in cautious optimism. The progress looked impressive on the maps, colored lines moving forward across the paper. But on the ground, it was meaningless. Each advance was measured in bodies, each trench held only until the next bombardment. Haig saw the devastation and called it necessary. These men are giving their lives for a noble cause, he said. We must continue until the enemy's spirit is broken. Rawlinson watched his commander and said nothing. He had long since stopped arguing. He, too, was trapped in the machinery of the war, a system that demanded movement, that could not stop even when it achieved nothing. Behind them, in London, politicians debated whether the offensive should continue. Some demanded results. Others feared that stopping now would mean admitting failure. So the battle went on. In the last week of July, the fighting focused on the high ground around Pozieres, a small village that had become the key to the German defenses. The Australians were brought in to take it. They went forward through a barrage so intense it seemed to blot out the sky. We lived in a sort of volcanic inferno, one survivor wrote. The earth shook, the air was on fire, and men disappeared without a trace. When the Australians reached the village, they found nothing left of it, only craters and rubble. The Germans counterattacked day and night, and Pozieres changed hands several times before it was finally secured. By then, The Australians had suffered more than 23,000 casualties in less than 2 weeks. Haig was impressed by their courage and noted in his diary that the Australians fought magnificently. To the men themselves, it meant little. They had seen their friends obliterated, their ranks shredded, their officers gone. "We're fighting ghosts now," one private wrote. "There's no village, no trenches, just holes in the ground where men used to be." The constant shelling changed everything. The landscape was no longer recognizable, a sea of craters stretching for miles. Maps became useless, landmarks vanished, and even the concept of direction lost meaning. Soldiers navigated by instinct, by memory, by the sound of the guns. The horizon was a blur of smoke. When it rained, the craters filled with water, turning the battlefield into a swamp. Men drowned in the mud, their cries muffled as the earth swallowed them. Others were buried alive by collapsing trench walls. It was as if the land itself was trying to consume them. By the end of July, the British Army had learned much about artillery coordination, about communication, about the limits of courage. But every lesson came too late for the men who had already died. The general spoke of progress, of improvement, of learning through experience. The soldiers called it murder by mathematics. Still, the offensive went on. Haig remained convinced that victory was close. He believed the Germans were weakening, that one more push would break them. The Battle of Pozieres Ridge, the capture of Bazenin, the struggle for Delville Wood. Each was seen as a step toward final success. But the truth was that both armies were bleeding to death. The Germans held firm, their discipline unbroken. The British pushed harder, throwing more men into the line. And above it all, the guns never ceased. At night, the battlefield glowed with artillery flashes. The horizon pulsed red, like a heartbeat. The noise rolled across the countryside, heard even in the quiet villages miles behind the front. Civilians spoke of it as the constant thunder. The soldiers called it simply the music of the Somme. It was the sound of an entire generation being spent. When July finally ended, the battle had raged for a full month. The British had advanced barely 3 miles. The cost was staggering, more than 200,000 casualties. The Germans had suffered nearly as many. The Somme had become a vast machine of destruction, grinding both sides down without mercy. The men still standing could no longer remember the world before the noise. Sleep came in snatches, dreams filled with smoke and fire. Letters from home felt like messages from another life. Haig looked at the numbers and called it success. "The enemy is near exhaustion," he wrote in his report. "The Somme has achieved its purpose." But to the soldiers in the trenches, there was no sense of achievement, only the dull certainty that tomorrow would bring more of the same. More shells, more mud, more names to be read out at roll call, and then forgotten. As August approached, the Somme still burned. The battle that had begun as a grand offensive to end the war had become something else entirely, a slow, grinding nightmare without end. Haig saw hope in every crater gained, but the men who fought for those craters saw only futility. They had learned the new laws of modern war, that courage alone was not enough, that bravery could not stop bullets, and that in the end, the battlefield belonged to the guns. The Somme was teaching its lessons, but each one was written in blood. And as the sun set on the last day of July, casting long shadows over the shattered ridges, the thunder of the guns rose again, echoing through the night, promising that the killing would continue. Haig still believed victory was coming. The men in the trenches no longer cared what victory meant. They only wanted the noise to stop. But the Somme was not finished with them. The worst was yet to come. Chapter 8. The Birth of the Tank. A new weapon appears, September 1916. By September of 1916, the Somme had already become an endless graveyard of hope. The battle had raged for over 2 months, and the front still looked much as it had in July, a shattered line of craters and mud, stretching as far as the eye could see. The sound of artillery was constant, the air always heavy with smoke and the bitter tang of cordite. Men lived in a world without silence, a world where the earth itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of explosions. They had fought for weeks to gain mere yards, and every inch of ground was littered with bodies. Yet, amid this carnage, something new was stirring, a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. It had a name whispered with both curiosity and doubt: the tank. For months, rumors had spread through the ranks of a secret machine, something armored, something unstoppable. Some called a landship, others said it was a moving fortress. Few had seen one, and those who had spoke of it, as if describing a myth. A metal beast, one soldier wrote home, that crawls like a monster and spits fire. The men laughed, thinking it was another wild rumor, a fantasy to distract them from the endless mud. But deep behind the front, in the fields near Amiens, crews were being trained on the real thing. The Mark I tank, a creation of steel, rivets, and smoke. The idea of such a machine had been born long before the Somme, in the minds of engineers and visionaries who dreamed of breaking the stalemate of trench warfare. The Western Front had turned the modern battlefield into a fortress, where barbed wire and machine guns ruled, and no army could advance without suffering catastrophic losses. What was needed was a way to cross that deadly space, to roll over wire, crush defenses, and protect men from gunfire. The solution came from an unlikely source: the factories of England, where engineers adapted agricultural tractors into war machines. It was Winston Churchill, then head of the Admiralty, who first supported the project, seeing its potential to change everything. The early prototypes were called landships, and to disguise their purpose, they were labeled water tanks on shipping manifests. The name stuck. By September, the first of these strange vehicles had arrived at the front. They were crude, unreliable, and slow, but they were revolutionary. Each weighed around 30 tons, powered by a heavy Daimler engine that growled like a beast in pain. Their armor was thick enough to withstand rifle fire, and their sides bristled with machine guns and 6-pounder cannons. Inside, the crews of 8 men worked in unbearable heat and noise. The air was thick with fumes and the stench of oil and sweat. There were no seats, no windows, only small slits through which to see. When the engine started, the entire machine shook violently, rattling bolts loose and deafening the crew. It was an iron coffin, but it promised something no soldier had known for 2 years: protection. Haig had pinned great hopes on this new weapon. After the bloody lessons of July and August, he believed the tanks could succeed where men alone had failed. If they could lead the next assault, perhaps they could break the German line and finally achieve the breakthrough that had eluded him. The target would be the small French village of Fleurs, near Courcelette, on the northern sector of the front. The plan was simple in theory: a massive coordinated attack with infantry, artillery, and tanks working together. The date was set for September 15th. Haig called it the beginning of a new era of warfare. In the days leading up to the attack, the tanks were moved toward the front under heavy secrecy. Covered in tarps, they lumbered along the muddy roads at a walking pace, escorted by engineers and mechanics. Their engines groaned, their treads clanked loudly against the stones. Curious soldiers stopped to stare as the machines rolled past. Some cheered, others shook their heads in disbelief. "They look like barns on wheels," one man muttered. "They'll never make it." Even their crews had doubts. The machines broke down constantly during training, and each one required constant maintenance just to move a few miles. Still, hope was stronger than skepticism. For a brief moment, the men believed this could be the weapon to end the slaughter. The morning of September 15th was cold and overcast. The guns opened fire before dawn, pounding the German lines with renewed fury. The bombardment rolled forward like thunder, and behind it, the tanks began to move. They lurched out of their hiding places, belching smoke and steam. The ground shook as they advanced, crawling slowly toward the enemy lines. It was a sight no one had ever seen: 32 massive machines lumbering across the battlefield, their engines roaring, their armor glinting dully in the gray light. The men who followed cheered, shouting, "Go on, you beauties! Give it to the Hun!" For once, The fear that gripped every assault seemed to fade. They had something in front of them stronger than flesh and bone. The tanks advanced at barely 3 miles per hour, but to those watching, it felt like power incarnate. German soldiers, seeing them for the first time, were stunned. Some ran in panic, shouting "Teufelwagen," devil wagons. Others stood their ground, firing their rifles and machine guns uselessly against the steel hulls. The bullets ricocheted harmlessly off the armor, making a sound like rain on a roof. The tanks crushed wire, crossed trenches, and flattened parapets. Inside, the crews worked frantically, sweating in the suffocating heat, their hands blistered from the vibrating controls. The noise was unbearable, the roar of the engine, the clatter of the tracks, the deafening echo of their own guns firing. Communication was almost impossible. Orders were shouted over the mechanical chaos, and often misheard or ignored. At Fleurs, one of the tanks led the way into the village, firing both cannons as it went. The infantry followed close behind, sheltering in its shadow. For the first time since the battle began, the British advance seemed unstoppable. They broke into the German front lines, capturing trenches and strong points that had resisted months of bombardment. By midday, the village of Fleurs was in British hands. Soldiers raised a flag over the ruins, cheering wildly. One message sent back to headquarters read simply, "A tank is walking up the high street of Fleurs with the troops cheering behind." It was a moment of triumph, of vindication. For the first time in months, the British Army had done something no one thought possible. They had broken through. Haig received the news with quiet satisfaction. In his diary, he wrote, "The tanks did splendidly. A great success." He believed the breakthrough was within reach. He ordered reserves forward, convinced that this was the moment the Germans would collapse. But as the day wore on, the limitations of the new weapon became painfully clear. Of the 32 tanks that had started the attack, only 9 made it to the front line. The rest broke down, bogged in the mud, or were hit by artillery. Some simply stopped, their engines overheated, their crews choking on fumes. Those that did reach the enemy trenches often became trapped in the craters they were meant to cross. Still, for those who saw them in action, the tanks were unforgettable. They inspired awe, fear, and even affection. Soldiers called them monsters and dragons, yet they followed them without hesitation. The psychological impact was immense. For the first time, men felt that the balance of power might be shifting, that flesh might finally have an answer to machine guns. Even the Germans, shocked by this new weapon, were forced to adapt quickly. Their reports described the tanks as formidable, but vulnerable to artillery fire and obstacles. Within weeks, they began developing new tactics, armor-piercing ammunition, trenches too wide for tanks to cross, and specialized infantry teams armed with grenades. The age of the machine had begun, and with it, a new arms race. For the men who fought at Flers-Courcelette, the memory of that day would never fade. They had seen something that seemed impossible, machines moving where men could not, crossing the killing fields that had claimed so many lives. They had watched them crush wire and silence guns, and for a brief moment, they had believed the war might finally change. But when the smoke cleared and the maps were studied, the truth became clear. The breakthrough had not come. The British had advanced barely 2 miles. The cost had been enormous. 29,000 casualties for a few shattered villages and a handful of tanks that could barely move. The promise of revolution had become another chapter in the long, grinding war of attrition. Haig, however, saw it differently. He believed the tank had proven its worth, that its potential was limitless. "This weapon," he wrote, "will win future wars." He was right, but not yet. The Mark I was only a beginning, a crude, clumsy prototype of what was to come. But on that gray September day, amid the mud and fire of the Somme, the world had changed. The old way of war, men charging through wire and bullets, had met its successor. The soldiers who fought that day were less certain. For them, the tanks were marvels, but they were not salvation. They still had to fight for every yard, still had to face the same horrors. The novelty of the machines faded quickly in the face of the same old pain. The tanks were fine, one survivor wrote, until they broke down. Then it was just us again, crawling through the mud. Another wrote simply, they made us believe for one day that we were winning. That was all. The Battle of Flers-Courcelette marked the end of the Somme's summer campaign. The rain returned, the mud deepened, and the battlefield sank into misery once more. The tanks were hauled back for repairs, the men for rest that never truly came. The lines barely moved. The Germans dug in again, and the war returned to its familiar rhythm of bombardment and blood. But something had changed, something that could not be undone. The idea of the tank had been born, and with it, the future. When night fell over the Somme, the wrecks of the first tanks lay scattered across the fields, silent and smoking. Some burned until morning, their metal glowing red in the dark. The men who passed them whispered, as if they were sacred, relics of a new age. They didn't know it then, but they had witnessed the dawn of mechanized warfare, a dawn that would cast a long, cold shadow over the rest of the century. Haig believed the battle had justified his faith. He wrote to London, praising the courage of the men and the promise of the machines. The enemy is weakening, he declared. Victory is only a matter of time. But those who had fought knew better. They had seen the cost. They had carried the wounded, buried the dead, and stood beside the smoking hulks of the tanks that were supposed to save them. They had seen that no machine, no invention, could change the simple, brutal truth of the Somme, that progress came only through sacrifice, and that even the strongest steel could not shield a man from the madness of war. The Somme had consumed the summer, and now reached into autumn. The guns still thundered, the mud still swallowed men whole, and the sky still glowed red at night. But beneath it all, hidden in the ruins and the wreckage, the world was shifting. The tank had arrived, and with it, the promise and the terror of a new kind of warfare, one that would shape every battle yet to come. And as the last echoes of the bombardment faded into the mist, the soldiers who had survived Flers looked at the twisted hulks around them and wondered if the birth of this machine was not just the dawn of a new weapon, but the beginning of something far darker, a future where the machines would never stop moving and the world would never again be the same. Chapter 9: Mud, Blood, and Fire. The Endless Grind, October 1916. By October of 1916, the Battle of the Somme had become a landscape of ghosts. The once golden fields of northern France were now an ocean of mud and smoke, where nothing green survived, and the air itself seemed poisoned. The trees that once lined the river valleys stood as blackened stumps, their limbs torn away by months of shell fire. The villages had vanished, replaced by names on maps and piles of rubble indistinguishable from the earth itself. Even the sky was different, gray, always gray, choked with the haze of artillery smoke and rain that never seemed to end. For the men who lived and fought there, time had lost meaning. Days and nights blurred together under the same rhythm of thunder, the same smell of rot, and the same unending fear. The Somme was no longer a battle. It was a storm that refused to stop. The introduction of the tank at Flers-Courcelette had given a brief flicker of hope. For one fleeting moment, it seemed as though the war might change. That man's ingenuity might overcome the slaughter. But the machines had broken down, the advance had stalled, and the promise of breakthrough dissolved into mud. By October, the tanks were gone from the front lines, hauled away for repair, leaving the infantry once again to face the war alone. What remained was the same old pattern: the bombardment, the charge, the machine guns, the blood. And now, with the autumn rains turning the battlefield into a swamp, even the ground itself became an enemy. The rains began in early October, falling without pause. Within days, the trenches filled with water, and the craters became deep, sucking pools of mud that could swallow a manhole. The soil of the Somme was a thick, chalky clay that trapped every drop. Soldiers waded through it waist-deep, their boots sucked off their feet with every step. Rifles jammed with mud. Shells sank before exploding, and even the wounded could not be moved. The rain erased everything: the trenches, the landmarks, the very line between front and rear. It was as if the earth itself had decided to devour the living and the dead alike. To fight under such conditions was beyond imagination. The men were always wet, always cold, their skin cracked and bleeding. Their uniforms were stiff with filth. They slept sitting up, leaning against the trench wall, their feet submerged in freezing water. Rats scurried across their legs, feeding on corpses half buried in the mud. The smell was indescribable: rotting flesh, wet wool, oil, and the faint sweetness of decay. The Somme, one soldier wrote, wasn't just a place. It was something that lived, and it hated us. Haig's optimism did not waver. Despite the endless rain and the mounting casualties, he continued to believe that victory was close. In early October, he ordered another series of attacks to capture the remaining German strongholds on the Thiepval Ridge and the Transloy Heights. He told his commanders that the enemy was nearly broken. The German army, he insisted, could not endure much longer. But the enemy was far from broken. The Germans had learned. Their new defensive system was flexible, resilient, and deadly. They no longer clung to the front trenches as they had in July. Instead, they fell back, luring the British forward into pre-sighted kill zones. When the British advanced, the Germans waited until they were in the open and then unleashed their counterfire with terrifying precision. The artillery duels grew even more intense. The British now had thousands of guns in position, firing millions of shells each week. The sound never stopped. The air quivered with it. Villages miles behind the front shook as though under an earthquake. Horses went mad, men lost their hearing, and the landscape itself began to crumble under the constant impact. But for all that noise, for all that fury, the results were the same: craters upon craters, wires still uncut, and machine guns still waiting. In the village of Goodcourt, the 6th Division advanced through knee-deep mud. They moved in silence, their boots squelching in the muck, their faces pale under the helmets slick with rain. The bombardment had failed to cut the wire, and when the signal came to go forward, they hesitated only for a moment before stepping into the storm. Bullets hissed through the rain like angry bees. Shells burst in the distance, sending geysers of mud into the air. Men vanished without a sound, swallowed by the swamp. Those who reached the German lines found themselves fighting not just the enemy but the elements: rifles that wouldn't fire, grenades that misfired, trenches filled with water waist deep. When night fell, there was no rest. They dug in wherever they stood, using their helmets to bail out water, praying the next shell would not find them. The letters that made it home from those weeks read like fragments of a nightmare. "It's like fighting in a grave," one man wrote to his wife. "The ground eats you, the rain blinds you, and the air never stops shaking." Another wrote simply, "There's no world outside the mud." The men had stopped talking about victory. They fought because they were told to, because there was no other choice. Survival became their only mission. For Haig, every attack, no matter how small, was part of a larger design. He saw the Somme as a campaign of grinding destruction, not a single battle, but a process of wearing the enemy down. And in a way, he was right. The German army was bleeding. Their reserves were stretched thin, their morale was faltering. They had lost over 500,000 men. But the price for that slow, invisible progress was unbearable. The British army was bleeding just as heavily, and the men who survived were changing. The idealism that had filled the new army in 1914 was gone, replaced by something harder, quieter: endurance. In mid-October, the British attacked again, this time toward the Butte de Warlencourt, a mound of chalk that rose above the battlefield like a white ghost. It had little strategic value, but Haig believed it symbolized control of the ridge. The Germans knew it, too, and turned it into a fortress. For days, the British shelled it without pause, turning the slope into liquid mud. When the infantry went forward, they found themselves climbing not a hill, but a mire. Each step forward slid half a step back. The Germans, sheltered in dugouts at the base, waited until the attackers were in the open before firing. Men were cut down in waves, tumbling into shell holes that filled instantly with water. The wounded drowned where they fell. Those who reached the top found nothing but death, a barren mound littered with bodies and broken weapons. The survivors slipped and crawled back down, too exhausted even to curse. The butte remained in German hands. Haig called the attack a partial success. His headquarters staff compiled the usual reports, listing objectives achieved, ground gained, enemy resistance severe but weakening. The official language of the war had become detached from the reality of it. On paper, progress looked steady. On the ground, it was misery without end. By late October, the weather worsened further. The rain turned to sleet, the mud to ice. The nights grew longer, colder. Frost formed on the sandbags, and the wind cut through soaked uniforms like knives. The men wrapped themselves in blankets that never dried. They huddled together in dugouts that smelled of damp wood, tobacco, and despair. Yet even in that hell, moments of humanity persisted. They brewed tea over small fires, sang songs quietly in the dark, shared what little food they had. They told stories of home, of streets and faces that seemed like another life. For a few minutes, they remembered they were still human. Then the guns would start again, and the dream would end. On the German side, the suffering was no less. Their trenches, once marvels of engineering, were collapsing under the constant bombardment. Their rations were dwindling, their troops exhausted. Letters from German soldiers told the same story. Endless shelling, endless mud, endless death. "We live like animals," one wrote. "We eat, we wait, we hope not to die today." Both armies were trapped in the same nightmare, separated only by a few hundred yards of no man's land. In London, the government pressed Haig for results. The public had begun to question the battle that never seemed to end. The newspapers still printed tales of bravery and progress, but the casualty lists grew longer every week. Mothers and wives across Britain waited for the knock on the door that would change everything. The optimism of the early war years had evaporated. Now, there was only endurance, the grim belief that the war must go on, no matter the cost. On the front, the soldiers no longer spoke of patriotism or glory. They fought for their comrades, for the man beside them in the trench. That bond, born of shared terror, became the only thing that mattered. "You don't fight for England," one veteran later said. "You fight for the bloke next to you. And when he's gone, you fight for the next one." By the end of October, the battlefield had devoured everything. Villages like Lussars, Eaucourt-l'Abbé, and Lesbos were nothing but names. The British had advanced a few miles since July, at the cost of nearly 400,000 casualties. The Germans had lost just as many. The lines had moved, but the war had not. Haig continued to believe that his strategy was working. "The enemy is at breaking point," he wrote. "Another month of pressure will end it." But those who lived through October knew otherwise. The enemy was not the only one breaking. The men themselves were reaching their limits. Their faces were gray, their eyes hollow. They moved like sleepwalkers, obeying orders automatically. The Somme had taken everything from them: youth, innocence, even the sense of what the battle was for. As November approached, the guns still roared, the shells still fell, and the mud grew deeper. The Somme had become a world of its own, a world of endurance, where the only victory was survival. The tanks had come and gone, the strategies had changed, but the outcome was always the same. Men went forward, men died, and the line stayed still. When the month ended, the soldiers looked out across the battlefield and saw only ruin. The land was stripped of life, the rivers ran brown with silt and blood, and the skies hung low with smoke. The Somme was not a place anymore. It was a scar across the world, and it would never heal. In the quiet between bombardments, when the wind blew across the shattered ridges, men could hear the faint sound of voices, not from the living, but from the thousands who had fallen and still lay beneath the mud. The war was not over. The Somme was not finished. But for those who had survived October, there was no longer any illusion left. The battle had become its own purpose, its own machine, grinding on because it could not stop. The promise of victory had drowned in the mud, and only endurance remained. The guns still thundered. The rain still fell. The men still waited. And somewhere, deep within the gray fog that hung over the Somme, the war whispered its only truth, that here, in this place of mud and fire, no one would ever truly win. Chapter 10. The End of the Somme. November's Frozen Silence. November 1916. By November of 1916, the Battle of the Somme had devoured an entire season. It had begun with the bright promise of summer and ended in a wasteland of winter mud, gray skies, and frozen corpses. The guns still thundered, but their sound was hollow now, echoing across a landscape that no longer seemed part of the living world. The soldiers who had once stepped proudly in a battle were ghosts of themselves, thin, hollow-eyed, moving through the sludge like sleepwalkers. The uniforms that had once been khaki were now indistinguishable from the mud. The rifles were rusted, the trenches were flooded, and the air stank of rot, cordite, and despair. There was no longer talk of victory. There was only endurance. The battle had stretched on for 141 days. Every promise of breakthrough had dissolved into the same result. Thousands dead, yards gained, and the front line barely moved. The tanks had come and gone. The rain had turned the world to liquid, and now the frost was setting in, hardening the mud into jagged crusts of ice. The Somme had become a monument to exhaustion. The men no longer asked why they fought. They simply did as they were told. The great offensive that was supposed to break the stalemate of the Western Front had instead become the symbol of it. In early November, Haig ordered one final series of attacks. He wanted to end the campaign with something that could be called a success, a last push before the weather made fighting impossible. The objective was the village of Beaumont-Hamel, still in German hands since the first day of the battle. It was a name that haunted the British Army. Thousands had died trying to take it in July, and now, for months later, they would try again. The men who prepared for this assault were not the same soldiers who had begun the Somme. They were harder, quieter, older in their eyes if not in their years. The lessons of the past months had been carved into their bones. They knew what was coming. The attack began on November 13th, under a low, heavy sky. The rain had turned to sleet, and the ground was a slick, frozen wasteland. The artillery opened up before dawn, lighting the horizon with orange flashes. The bombardment was shorter and more precise than before. The British gunners had learned much since July. The shells landed in tighter patterns, the timing better synchronized. When the infantry went forward, they did so behind a creeping barrage that moved just ahead of them like a wall of fire. The men followed close behind, their boots crunching through the frost, their breath white in the air. This time, the plan worked. The Germans, exhausted and short on reserves, were caught off guard. Their trenches, already weakened by months of shelling, crumbled under the renewed assault. At Beaumont-Hamel, the 51st Highland Division advanced with a grim efficiency that was born from 4 months of slaughter. They moved through the smoke with discipline, clearing trenches one by one, bayonets flashing in the pale light. By midday, the village that had defied the British since July was finally taken. The Union Jack was raised over the ruins. For the first time since the battle began, there was something that resembled victory. But victory was a strange word on the Somme. Beaumont-Hamel was a ruin of mud and rubble, its church reduced to a heap of stones, its fields a mass of craters filled with water and corpses. The men who took it found no joy in the triumph. They stood silently among the wreckage, staring at what was left. It wasn't a village anymore, one soldier wrote. It was a graveyard that happened to have a name. Haig received the news with satisfaction. He called the capture of Beaumont-Hamel a fine conclusion to the Somme offensive. To him, it proved that his strategy of relentless pressure had worked. The Germans were withdrawing, the line was moving, and he believed the enemy was close to collapse. But for the soldiers who lived it, there was no sense of closure. The victory came too late, bought at too high a price. The ground they stood on was soaked with the blood of every failed attempt before. They had taken the village. but the cost was measured in generations. The final days of the battle were fought not against men, but against the weather itself. The rain returned, heavier than before, and the frost turned the trenches into pits of ice. The mud was no longer liquid but solid, cutting through boots and freezing around ankles. The wounded froze where they fell, unable to move. The men carried picks and shovels just to break the ground enough to dig shallow graves. The guns still fired, but even their thunder seemed muted by the cold. The smoke hung low, unmoving. The war had slowed to a crawl, as if the earth itself was refusing to cooperate any longer. By mid-November, it was clear the offensive could not continue. The guns fell silent more often, the shells came less frequently, and the orders from headquarters became shorter, more resigned. The Somme had run its course. The commanders began to talk of winter quarters, of consolidation, of holding the line until spring. On November 18th, the final British assault was launched near the Anchor River. It achieved little. The men advanced through snow and sleet, captured a few trenches, and then stopped. The Battle of the Somme was over. When the firing finally ceased, a strange quiet settled over the valley. The soldiers stood in their trenches, listening to the silence as if it were a new sound. For the first time in months, the thunder of artillery was gone, replaced by the distant cawing of crows and the whisper of the wind over the empty fields. The war was not over, far from it, but the battle that had defined a year had come to its exhausted end. The numbers were beyond comprehension. On the British side, more than 420,000 casualties. The French, over 200,000. The Germans, nearly 500,000. In total, more than 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing, for a stretch of ground less than 20 miles wide. The fields of the Somme were soaked with the blood of 3 nations. No victory could justify it. When Haig wrote his final report, he called the Somme a great success. He argued that it had worn down the German army, that it had relieved pressure on the French at Verdun, and that it had proved Britain's strength as a military power. In a cold, strategic sense, he was not entirely wrong. The German army had been weakened. Their commanders admitted privately that the Somme had drained them of reserves and shaken their confidence. But to the men who had fought there, those words meant nothing. They knew what it had cost. They had seen the faces of the dead, heard the cries of the wounded, and walked through fields where the ground itself seemed to moan. The price of that success was beyond measure. As winter set in, the survivors were withdrawn from the front. They marched back through the same roads they had come down in July, past the same ruined villages, the same shattered trees, but now the silence was heavier. They marched in lines, their rifles slung low, their boots caked with frozen mud. They passed the graves of their friends, marked by crude wooden crosses and names scratched into tin. Some stopped to look. Others cannot bear to. We left a part of ourselves there, one soldier wrote. Not just the dead, but something inside the living that would never come back. Behind them, the battlefield lay still. The craters were filled with ice, the rivers ran brown, and the fields were strewn with wreckage, helmets, rifles, broken wagons, and the skeletal remains of men and horses. In the villages behind the lines, the civilians began to return, picking through the ruins of their homes. They found bones in their gardens, shells in their wells, and the faint smell of smoke that would never truly fade. The Somme was no longer a place of war. It was a wound carved into the land itself. In London, the newspapers hailed the end of the offensive. The headlines spoke of heroism, of valor, of a hard but necessary victory. The truth was quieter, less glorious. Families across Britain opened telegrams that began with the same cold phrase, "Regret to inform you." The grief was immeasurable. Towns that had sent entire battalions of volunteers, the PALs, now faced the empty silence of loss. Streets that had once echoed with laughter were lined with black mourning ribbons. The war that had begun with parades and cheering had become a nation's sorrow. Haig returned to his headquarters, proud but weary. He believed history would vindicate him, that future generations would see the Somme as the turning point, the moment when Britain's army came of age, when it proved itself equal to any in the world. And perhaps, in a sense, he was right. The Somme had forged an army of citizens into soldiers. It had transformed Britain from a nation of volunteers into a machine of war. But it had also broken something deeper, the belief that war was noble, that sacrifice was clean, that death had meaning. The Somme stripped all that away, leaving only the raw truth of industrial slaughter. For the men who had survived, the memories would never fade. They dreamed of the Somme for the rest of their lives. The thunder, the screams, the faces half buried in the mud. Some never spoke of it again. Others wrote about it endlessly, trying to make sense of what they had seen. "We thought we were fighting for civilization," one veteran later said. But on the Somme, civilization itself seemed to die. The winter of 1916 settled heavily over the Western Front. Snow fell on the ruins, covering the craters and the corpses alike. The guns were silent, but the silence was not peace. It was the pause before the next storm. The war would continue for 2 more years, through new battles just as terrible: Arras, Passchendaele, Cambrai. The Somme was not the end, only a prelude. But for those who had been there, it was the moment when the world changed. When spring came again, the fields of the Somme would bloom once more. Grass would grow over the craters, wildflowers over the graves. But beneath that thin skin of green, the scars would remain. The bones would remain. The echo of the guns would remain. The Somme was not just a battle. It was a reckoning, a reminder of what humanity could do to itself when pride, fear, and faith collided. As the last soldiers marched away from the frozen trenches in November, the wind swept over the empty fields, carrying with it the faint sound of something that might have been a sigh, the sound of the Somme itself, exhaling the ghosts of 1,000,000 men. The battle was over, but its shadow would stretch far into the future. It was the sound of an age ending, the end of innocence, the death of the old world. And in its place, something colder, harder, and infinitely sadder was born. The modern world, baptized not in glory, but in mud and blood. Chapter 11. Aftermath. The cost of victory and the weight of memory. When the guns finally fell silent on the Somme, the silence felt almost unnatural. For 4 months, the earth had shaken, the skies had burned, and the air itself had screamed with the roar of shells. Then, suddenly there was nothing. No thunder, no fire, only the wind whispering over a land that no longer looked like part of the world. The soldiers who remained stood in their trenches, listening, unable to believe it was real. Some laughed quietly. Others wept. The noise that had defined their lives was gone, and in its place came a silence filled with ghosts. The Battle of the Somme was over, but its shadow was only beginning to fall. The men who survived began the long walk back from the front. They moved through a landscape that seemed torn out of some ancient nightmare. What had once been fields and villages was now a wilderness of mud and craters, littered with the wreckage of war, shattered helmets, broken rifles, rusted bayonets, and the half-buried dead. There were no landmarks, no roads, only the jagged scars of trenches winding endlessly across the earth. The smell was unforgettable, a mixture of wet soil, gunpowder, and decay. The rain never stopped, and the mud clung to everything, thick and cold as cement. Some of the men stumbled as they walked, not from exhaustion alone, but from disbelief. They had lived through the unimaginable, and now they were leaving it behind, though part of them would never truly leave. Behind them, the battlefield lay still, covered in a thin layer of frost. Horses lay frozen in their harnesses. Tanks rusted where they had stopped months earlier. The bodies of the fallen, British, French, and German alike, lay scattered across no man's land, too many to count, too many to bury. In some places, the corpses had become part of the landscape itself, buried beneath layers of mud and shrapnel. The earth of the Somme was made of flesh and metal now, fused into one. Farmers who returned after the war would say their plows struck bones every spring. The ground itself had become a grave. When Haig reported to London, He called the Somme a hard but necessary success. He argued that the battle had achieved its goal. The German army had been worn down, its reserve shattered, its morale shaken. And in a sense, he was right. The Germans had suffered immense losses, over 460,000 men. Their commanders admitted privately that the Somme had changed them, that the strain of those 4 months had forced them to adapt or collapse. But the British Empire had paid nearly the same price, over 420,000 casualties, 19,000 dead on the first day alone. The French had lost 200,000. The total count was over 1 million men. And the front line, after all that death, had moved barely 6 miles. The arithmetic of war had reached madness. In the towns and villages across Britain, the news of the Somme came slowly. At first, there were headlines of victory. British advance continues. German line broken. New army proves its worth. But then came the telegrams. Every morning, postmen walked the same streets, knocking on doors, delivering the same small, folded papers that began with the same terrible words. Regret to inform you. Entire neighborhoods went silent. The PALS battalions, men who had enlisted together from the same towns, the same factories, the same football clubs, were gone. One morning, a street would wake to find that every son, every brother, every husband had been lost in the same hour. The grief was immeasurable. There were too many dead to bring home, too many missing to ever be found. Families built their own memorials, empty chairs at dinner tables, photographs on mantels, names whispered in church prayers. The government promised that every fallen soldier would be honored, that no grave would be forgotten. The Imperial War Graves Commission began the immense task of marking the dead. Architects and artists were brought in to design cemeteries worthy of their sacrifice. Rows upon rows of white stones began to rise on the fields of France. Each one bore a name, a regiment, and a simple phrase, known unto God. Haig visited the front again in December, walking through the ruins of what had once been the battlefield. The mud had hardened in the cold, and a thin snow dusted the shell holes. He stood on the ridge near Thiepval, looking out over the valley where so many had died. His staff walked beside him in silence. To them, the ground represented victory, the proof that Britain could stand against the greatest army in the world. To the soldiers who had fought there, it represented something else, lost beyond words. Haig believed history would remember the Somme as a triumph of endurance. He was right about that, though not in the way he imagined. In the months that followed, Britain changed. The Somme had transformed not only the army, but the nation itself. The volunteer ideal that had filled the ranks in 1914 was gone. Too many had died. Conscription was now law, and the war machine demanded constant feeding. The optimism that had carried men to the recruiting stations was replaced by something colder: duty, obligation, inevitability. The Somme had shown that victory would not come through courage alone, but through industry, machinery, and relentless attrition. The modern age of warfare had begun, and with it, the death of an older world. For the soldiers who came home, the return to civilian life was not simple. They carried the Somme with them in their bodies and their minds. Many were maimed or blinded, others haunted by memories that would not fade. They woke at night to the sound of phantom artillery, the echo of the whistles that sent them over the top. Some could not bear to talk about it. Others could not stop. They spoke of the mud that swallowed men whole, of the smell of death that clung to their skin, of the cries that came from the darkness after every bombardment. The doctors called it shell shock, but the term did little to explain the depth of what they had endured. Those who had fought at the Somme found themselves changed in ways they could not explain to those who hadn't. The world outside the trenches seemed distant, almost unreal. Crowds, laughter, even silence felt strange. "We left our youth in France," one man wrote. Whatever came back wasn't the same. Yet despite their suffering, they carried themselves with a quiet dignity. They had seen hell, and somehow they had survived. That survival itself felt like defiance. The German soldiers who faced them shared much of the same experience. For them, too, the Somme was a scar that never healed. Letters recovered from their trenches spoke of awe and horror, of the endless bombardments, the nights spent buried underground, the feeling that the world had been reduced to noise and fear. Many wrote of respect for the British, admiration even for their persistence. They came again and again. One German officer wrote, "No man could fight like that unless he believed deeply in something." But what both sides believed in had become harder to define. The war had stripped meaning from words like glory and honor. There was only endurance and survival and loss. When spring came to the Somme in 1917, the grass began to grow again. Poppies bloomed among the ruins. Farmers returned to their fields, though every furrow they plowed turned up rusted metal and bones. The sound of guns still echoed in the distance. The war was not over, but on the Somme itself, there was a strange calm. The land was alive again, but it would never be the same. It carried its memories beneath the soil, silent and unspoken. In the years after the war, the world tried to make sense of what had happened there. Writers, poets, and artists returned to the Somme, searching for meaning among the ruins. They stood where the trenches had been, where the mud had swallowed men by the thousands, and tried to put into words what could not be described. Their works became the voice of a generation, not the generals or politicians, but the ordinary men who had lived and died in that inferno. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Edmund Blunden, their poems spoke of the pity of war, of the beauty and horror interwoven. They wrote of courage not as triumph, but as survival amid madness. In 1932, the Thiepval Memorial was unveiled, a vast arch of stone rising above the former battlefield. It bore the names of more than 72,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who had no known grave. Visitors who stood before it often wept in silence. Beneath its shadow, the wind carried the whispers of those who had vanished into the mud. "Here is the world's wound," one veteran said, standing before the memorial. "And here will bleed forever." For Haig, the years after the war were filled with both honor and controversy. He was made an earl, hailed by some as the man who led Britain to victory, condemned by others as the butcher of the Somme. He defended his decisions until his death, insisting that every life lost was part of a necessary price. "We fought a war of exhaustion," he said, "and we endured longer than the enemy." History would never fully agree with him, nor fully condemn him. The truth lay somewhere between. The Somme had achieved something, though not what anyone had hoped. It had taught the world that modern war was not about heroism or single moments of triumph. It was about machines, logistics, endurance, and sacrifice on a scale no one had imagined possible. It had shattered illusions of quick wars, of noble deaths, of invincibility. It showed that even victory could feel like loss, and it changed forever the way nations and men thought about conflict. For the soldiers who lived, the Somme became a measure of everything that followed. No hardship, no fear, no pain could compare. It haunted them in quiet moments, in the sound of thunder, in the smell of rain-soaked earth. They carried it in their hearts until their final days. Some returned to the fields years later, to stand in silence among the graves, to whisper names long gone. Others never returned, unable to face it again. But whether they stood in France or at home in quiet gardens, the Somme was always there, a place inside them that time could not touch. In the decades that followed, the world would go to war again, and the names of new battles would join the old: Dunkirk, Stalingrad, Normandy. But none would erase the shadow of the Somme. It was the moment when humanity first glimpsed the full horror of its own creation, when the industrial age met the ancient hunger for conquest, and the result was slaughter on a scale that defied comprehension. Even now, more than a century later, the Somme remains sacred ground. Beneath the rolling hills and quiet fields lie the bones of 1,000,000 men, their stories woven into the soil. The poppies still bloom there every summer, red as blood, their petals trembling in the wind. They are the only flowers that will grow easily in that earth, nourished by what lies beneath. Visitors walk the paths in silence, listening to the faint echo of guns that no one else can hear. And when the wind blows across the graves, it carries a whisper from another time, a reminder of the price of pride, the cost of war, and the resilience of those who endured it. The Battle of the Somme was not just a chapter in history. It was a warning written in blood. It taught the world that progress, when turned toward destruction, becomes its own enemy. It showed how nations can lose themselves in the pursuit of victory. And yet, it also revealed something else, that even in the darkest hell, men could still find courage, still hold on to each other, still fight not for glory, but for the simple will to live. When the last veterans of the Somme passed away, their memories did not die with them. They remained in letters, in diaries, in the quiet cemeteries scattered across the French countryside. And if you stand there today, in the early morning mist, and close your eyes, you can almost hear them. The distant rumble of guns, the murmured prayers of soldiers waiting to go over the top, the soft whisper of the wind through the poppies. The Somme is not silent. It never will be. It speaks still, in every heartbeat that remembers, in every moment of peace bought by their sacrifice. The battle ended in November 1916, but the story of the Somme will never truly end. It lives on in history, in memory, and in the quiet resolve of those who came after. A reminder that even in the face of endless darkness, the human spirit endures. And though the guns have long since fallen silent, their echoes still roll across that haunted land, whispering the same eternal truth, that the cost of war is measured not in miles or victories, but in lives, and in the silence that follows when the thunder is gone. Chapter 12, Echoes of the Somme, A Wounded Generation, 1917 to 1920. When the guns fell silent over the Somme, the world did not return to what it had been before. The thunder had stopped, the smoke had cleared, but the sound lingered inside those who had survived, a low, distant rumble that never really faded. The Battle of the Somme had ended in November of 1916, but for the men who fought there, for the families who lost them, and for the nations that sent them, the war did not end when the cannons ceased. It lived on, in the broken bodies, in the haunted eyes, in the empty chairs around kitchen tables. The Somme was not just a battlefield. It was a wound cut deep into the heart of humanity, and in the years that followed, that wound continued to bleed. The survivors came home to a country they no longer recognized. The streets were quieter, the laughter rarer, and the air heavy with grief. The young men who had marched off in 1914 with flags and songs returned older, harder, and carrying something that no one else could see. They had faced the end of the world in the trenches of France, and the world back home felt small and unreal in comparison. Some found solace in work or family. Others wandered aimlessly, unable to fit back into the rhythm of ordinary life. For every man who returned, there were empty spaces left behind, friends who would never come home, voices that would never be heard again. The hospitals were filled with the wounded, men with missing limbs, shattered faces, or eyes that no longer saw light the same way. Plastic surgery, still a new science, was born on the Somme. Doctors like Harold Gillies pioneered techniques to rebuild faces torn apart by shrapnel and fire. In those wards, men who had lost their identities were given new ones, crafted from skin grafts and steel plates. They wore masks when they went outside, not for their protection, but for the comfort of others. Behind those masks, the war continued, not in gunfire, but in silence. The mental wounds were harder to treat. Shell shock, they called it, though the name did little to describe the darkness that lived inside these men. They woke in the night screaming, their minds replaying the bombardments, the whistles, the sight of their comrades falling beside them. They flinched at sudden noises, hid under tables when thunder rolled, and wept without knowing why. In hospitals across Britain, doctors experimented with treatments, electric shocks, hypnosis, rest cures. But there was no true cure for what the Somme had done to the human spirit. Many of the broken were forgotten, dismissed as weak, told to pull themselves together. The world did not yet have words for trauma. It only had silence. In the villages of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, the war's shadow stretched long. Church bells rang for the armistice in 1918, but even as people cheered, they knew what had been lost could not be reclaimed. The Somme had taken the flower of a generation. Nearly every family had someone who never returned. A brother, a son, a husband. Photographs of smiling young men in uniform hung in parlors and living rooms, fading slowly with the years. Mothers kept their letters in boxes lined with fabric, reading them again and again until the paper wore thin. The grief became part of the landscape, unspoken, ever-present, woven into daily life. The fields of the Somme lay quiet again, but they were not the same. Farmers who returned found their land destroyed. The soil was filled with shrapnel, bones, and unexploded shells. Every plow turned up relics of the dead. Helmets, badges, the twisted remains of rifles. Some of the land was too poisoned to farm, too scarred to rebuild. The French called these zones terre sacrée, sacred ground. The earth itself had become a cemetery. The poppies grew first, blooming bright and red across the broken fields, their petals glowing in the morning light. They seemed to feed on the blood that lay beneath, and for those who saw them, they became a symbol, fragile, beautiful, and fleeting, just like the lives that had been lost. In 1919, pilgrims began to come to the Somme, widows, mothers, fathers, and brothers. They came from every corner of Britain and the Commonwealth, carrying flowers, letters, and tears. They walked among the rows of white crosses that had begun to rise in the new cemeteries. The graves stretched on for miles, endless lines of stone, each one identical, each one marking a story that had ended too soon. Some families found the names of their loved ones. Others found only the words, known unto God. Many found nothing at all. The missing were too many, their bodies lost forever in the mud. The Imperial War Graves Commission worked tirelessly to honor them all. Architects like Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker designed memorials that were not just monuments to victory, but to memory. The Thiepval Memorial rose on the ridge where the British had fought hardest, a vast arch of stone that carried 72,000 names, the men who had no grave. It was said that when the wind blew through its arches, it sounded like the low murmur of voices, as if the dead themselves were whispering. Haig, now a field marshal and national hero to some, continued to defend his decisions. He spoke of endurance, of sacrifice, of the necessity of the Somme. "We did not fight in vain," he said. "The enemy was broken, and the price we paid secured our victory." But outside the halls of command, the view was different. Writers and poets who had seen the front began to speak. Siegfried Sassoon wrote of the madness, Wilfred Owen of the pity. Their words captured what the official histories could not: the horror, the futility, and the quiet heroism of men who fought not for glory, but because they had no choice. "My subject is war," Owen wrote before his death in 1918, and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. The Somme became a symbol not only of courage, but of tragedy. It was remembered as the place where innocence died, where the old world of honor and empire was swept away by the brutal reality of industrial war. The machine guns, the shells, the gas, the tanks, these were the new gods of the battlefield, and humanity bowed before them. The soldiers who fought there became the first modern generation, not conquerors, but witnesses to their own destruction. In the years after the war, Europe tried to rebuild, but the ground itself seemed cursed. Villages were rebuilt brick by brick, but beneath the new foundations lay the ghosts of the old ones. Children playing in the fields would sometimes find bullets or rusted helmets, and their parents would quietly take them away. Every storm unearthed more bones. The farmers called it the harvest of iron. In Britain, the memorials rose in every town and village. Stone soldiers stood with bowed heads, carved names lined church walls, and the words, "Lest we forget," were engraved everywhere. On the 11th of November each year, people stood in silence, their heads bowed, as the church bells told the hour the guns had stopped. The 2 minutes of silence became a ritual, a bridge between the living and the dead. For those who had been there, the sound of silence was heavier than any bombardment. It was filled with memory. Haig himself spent his final years devoted to veterans, founding organizations to support the wounded and unemployed. He traveled the country, speaking to soldiers and widows, offering comfort where he could. But he was never free of the debate that followed him. To some, he was the man who led Britain to victory. To others, he was the architect of the Somme, the man who sent a generation to die. When he died in 1928, thousands lined the streets for his funeral. Many came not to honor or condemn, but simply to witness the passing of an era. With him, something of the old world went too. For the men who had fought, the Somme became the measure of everything that came after. They carried its lessons with them, about courage, about endurance, about the fragility of life. Some became pacifists, vowing that no war could ever be worth such a price again. Others believed the opposite, convinced that only strength could prevent another catastrophe. But whatever they believed, they all agreed on one thing. The Somme had changed them forever. As the 1920s unfolded, the world began to forget. The monuments stood, the cemeteries were kept, but life moved on. The children of the fallen grew up hearing stories of the Great War, a phrase that sounded noble but distant. They did not smell the mud, or hear the guns, or see the sky lit with fire. They did not know what it meant to hold a dying friend in the dark. The veterans watched this new generation with a mixture of relief and sadness. They wanted their children to live without fear, but they also wanted them to remember. "We fought," one old soldier said, "so they would never have to. But if they forget what it cost, they will fight again." The scars of the Somme reached far beyond the battlefield. It had reshaped the map of Europe, toppled empires, and planted the seeds of unrest that would grow into another war 2 decades later. But its deepest scars were not on the land or the politics of nations. They were in the hearts of those who lived through it. The war had shown them both the worst and best of humanity. It had revealed cruelty, indifference, and madness, but also loyalty, courage, and love. When the last veterans of the Somme were old men, they would sometimes return to France, to walk the fields where they had once fought. The land was quiet now, covered with grass and wildflowers. The trenches were faint lines in the earth, the craters filled with rainwater and reeds. They would stand by the white stones of the cemeteries and look out across the hills, remembering the sound of the guns, the faces of their friends, the world they had left behind. And when they spoke, it was softly. "We were just boys," one said. "We thought we were fighting to end all wars. We didn't know." Even now, over a century later, the Somme remains sacred. The fields are peaceful again, but the silence there feels different. Not empty, but full. Full of memory, full of presence. The poppies still bloom every summer, bright against the green hills, their red petals trembling in the wind. They are a reminder that beauty can grow even from the darkest soil, that life can return to places once filled with death. But they are also a warning, fragile, fleeting, easily forgotten. The Battle of the Somme ended in 1916, but its echoes never did. They carried through the decades, whispering in every moment of peace, reminding the world of what was lost and what must never be repeated. The men who fought there are gone now, their voices silent, their graves tended by strangers who know their names only from stone. Yet their story endures, not as legend or glory, but as truth. The truth that war is not the making of men, but their unmaking. And if you stand there today, on the ridges of Thiepval or the fields of Beaumont Hamel, as the evening light falls and the wind moves through the grass, you can almost hear them still, the faint, distant murmur of a generation that gave everything. It is not the sound of triumph, nor of despair, but of memory itself. The Somme speaks quietly now, but its message is eternal, never again. Chapter 13, The Long Shadow. How the Somme Changed War Forever, 1920 to 1940. The guns of the Somme had fallen silent, but the echoes never stopped. They rolled through the years that followed, through the hearts of the men who survived and the politics of the nations that rebuilt. The Somme was not just a battle. It was a warning written in blood and iron, a wound that shaped the century to come. Even after the last soldiers went home, after the grass grew over the trenches and the cemeteries filled with white stones, the war lived on, in the minds of generals, in the speeches of politicians, and in the fear that another storm would someday rise. In the quiet years after the war, the world tried to believe that the horror was over forever. The Treaty of Versailles promised peace, carved in paper and signatures, as if words could bind human nature. Across Europe, nations rebuilt themselves from rubble, cities patched their scars, and families tried to fill the empty spaces left by their dead. But beneath the calm surface, the ground still trembled with something restless, a feeling that what had been buried at the Somme might one day return. The generation that had fought there grew older, but they could not escape its shadow. Many became teachers, fathers, mayors, and veterans advocates. They built memorials and wrote memoirs. But when they closed their eyes, the images came back. The mud, the screams, the thunder that never stopped. Some found solace in religion, others in silence. The Somme had stripped away the illusions of glory and left only endurance. For them, life after the war was not peace. It was survival of a different kind. In Britain, the memory of the Somme became something sacred. Every village had its memorial. Every school had its list of names. The survivors gathered each year on Armistice Day, their medals pinned to their chests, standing in silence as the church bells tolled. The young watched them, trying to imagine what it had been like, but they could not. The world had moved on. Cars filled the streets, radios hummed with music, and the pace of life quickened. Yet under that modern rhythm was the same unease, the knowledge that mankind had seen what it was capable of and could never forget it. The war had changed everything about how nations fought and thought. Before the Somme, generals believed in movement, in decisive battles of courage and maneuver. After it, they believed in machines, in numbers and attrition. The battlefield had become a factory of death, production lines of shells, schedules of bombardments, and human beings reduced to calculations. The Somme taught that victory no longer belonged to the bravest, but to the most prepared, the most industrialized, the most willing to endure loss. It was a terrible lesson, and every nation remembered it in its own way. In Germany, the memory of the Somme festered into something darker. The soldiers who had fought there returned to a defeated nation, humiliated and broken. They remembered how the British guns had pounded them without mercy, how the tanks had rolled across the mud, how their comrades had vanished in clouds of fire. They carried that humiliation like a scar. Many of them, including a young corporal named Adolf Hitler, swore that Germany would never again be brought to its knees by the likes of the Somme. To them, the battle was not just defeat. It was betrayal. They believed their army had been stabbed in the back by politicians, by revolutionaries, by the collapse of will at home. It became a seed of vengeance, buried deep and waiting to grow. In Britain, the lessons of the Somme created a different kind of fear. The generals who had seen the slaughter swore it would never happen again. They rebuilt their army with defense in mind, strong lines, careful planning, slow, deliberate tactics. The very idea of another offensive on that scale was unthinkable. They built the Maginot Line in France, miles of concrete and steel, a fortress meant to prevent another Somme. But in preparing to never fight that kind of war again, they set themselves up for the next one, a war that would be faster, deadlier, and more unforgiving than anything they could imagine. The technology born from the Somme did not die with the armistice. The tank, the airplane, the machine gun, all had proven their worth in that hell. Now, engineers refined them, governments invested in them, and factories began to build machines not just for defense, but for domination. The Somme had shown that the future of war belonged to steel and oil. The men who had crawled through mud now watched from factories as engines roared to life, faster and more powerful than anything they had seen in 1916. The tools that were meant to end war had instead made the next one inevitable. Artists and writers tried to make sense of what had happened. Some painted landscapes of ruin, dark, endless skies over shattered trees. Others wrote of the absurdity of it all. Eric Maria remarks, All Quiet on the Western Front captured the emptiness of a generation that had survived but no longer understood the world. The book was banned in Germany by the rising Nazis, who called it defeatist. But the truth it carried was undeniable. The men who fought at the Somme had seen the end of civilization, and it had changed them forever. In schools, children learned about the war from maps and numbers. They saw photographs of trenches, diagrams of attacks, lists of casualties. But the reality, the mud, the fear, the endless waiting, could not be captured in lessons. It existed only in the memories of the old soldiers who sat quietly at the back of the Remembrance Day parades. They did not talk about heroism. They talked about luck, the luck to be alive, the luck to have come home when so many had not. The Thiepval Memorial, completed in 1932, stood as a monument to that generation's silence. It was not triumphant. It was solemn, vast, and hollow, a giant arch rising over the fields where so many had died. On its walls were carved the names of 72,000 men, with no known grave. When you stood beneath it, the air seemed to thicken, the weight of those names pressing down. It was said that on misty mornings, the sound of the wind through the arches resembled the distant roll of guns. Visitors came and stood in silence, as if listening to the voices of the dead. Haig's legacy lived on an argument. To some, he was the man who led Britain to victory. To others, he was the man who sent a generation to die for inches of ground. His defenders said he had no choice, that the Somme was the price of breaking an enemy entrenched too deep to dislodge by any other means. His critics saw the battle as proof of arrogance and blindness, of generals trapped in old thinking while their men paid the price. But whatever one believed, the truth was this. The Somme had been fought by human beings trying to understand something new, a kind of war that no one in history had faced before. The political world that emerged from those trenches was unstable. The men who had fought for democracy returned to find economies in ruin, jobs scarce, and governments uncertain. The promise that their sacrifice would make the world safe for peace rang hollow as dictators rose and ideologies clashed. The ghost of the Somme hovered over every meeting, every treaty, every speech about peace. Everyone remembered what had happened when pride and fear mixed in equal measure. Everyone feared it could happen again. By the 1930s, Europe was a continent of memorials, monuments built to remember, but also to forget. The white graves of the Somme were immaculate, tended by gardeners who worked year-round. The grass was always cut, the flowers always blooming. But in the cities, the world was changing fast. Radios spoke of rearmament, of nationalism, of revenge. And among the crowds who cheered for new leaders and new wars were the sons of the men who had fought at the Somme. They had grown up hearing stories of mud and misery, but they had not lived it. They believed the next war would be different, faster, cleaner, more glorious. They were wrong. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, many of the veterans of the Somme watched in silence. They knew what was coming. They had seen it all before, the excitement, the optimism, the belief that it would be quick. And then they watched as the world plunged once more into chaos, this time with machines born from the lessons of their own suffering. Tanks rolled across France, airplanes blackened the skies, and once again the earth trembled under the weight of war. The sons of the Somme were now the fathers of the fallen. Yet even amid the second great cataclysm, the memory of 1916 remained a guiding light for some. The British Expeditionary Force that fought in 1940 carried with it the institutional memory of the trenches, the discipline, the logistics, the knowledge of endurance. The world had changed, but the courage of ordinary men had not. On the beaches of Dunkirk, in the ruins of London, and across the fields of Normandy that would one day echo with new battles, the spirit of the Somme endured, not in glory, but in resilience. For all its horror, the psalm had forced the world to grow up. It shattered illusions about war and replaced them with truth, brutal, honest, unromantic truth. It taught that courage alone was not enough, that leadership had to evolve, that technology could not replace humanity. It showed that in the end, the real victory in war is not in conquest, but in survival. After the Second World War, the men who had fought in both conflicts, the ones old enough to remember 1916 and strong enough to have fought again, spoke rarely. They were weary of history repeating itself. They looked at the ruins of Europe and saw the same patterns, the same pride, the same blindness that had led to the Somme. We didn't learn, one veteran said quietly in 1945. We thought the first time was the end of madness. We were wrong. In the decades that followed, the Somme became not just a battlefield, but a lesson. Military academies studied it, historians debated it, philosophers wrote about it. Some saw it as the inevitable result of human ambition. Others saw it as the price of progress, the moment when technology outpaced compassion. But for those who had been there, it was simpler. The Somme was where they had seen humanity stripped bare, reduced to its most basic form: fear, pain, and endurance. When the last veterans of the battle died, their funerals were quiet affairs. There were no speeches of glory, only gratitude. They had lived through the unimaginable and carried its memory so others would not have to. Yet, even as they faded from the world, the shadow of the Somme remained. Every time nations marched to war, every time politicians spoke of sacrifice and necessity, the echo returned, a whisper from 1916 reminding them of what those words really meant. Today, the Somme's fields are peaceful again. The air smells of rain and soil, the rivers run clear, and the birds sing where once only guns spoke. But if you walk there long enough, if you listen closely, you can still feel the pulse of what happened, a vibration in the earth, faint but unending. The wind that moves through the poppies sounds almost like a sigh, a reminder from those who never came home. The Somme did not just change a war. It changed what war was. It changed how nations fought, how they mourned, and how they remembered. It changed the meaning of courage and the cost of pride. It turned hope into endurance and victory into survival. Its shadow stretches across the 20th century and beyond, a silent guardian of memory and a warning to all who would forget. And perhaps that is its final legacy, that in the stillness of its fields, where the bones of 1,000,000 men lie beneath the soil, the world can look and remember. Not the glory, not the banners, not the promises of greatness, but the truth. The truth that no matter how far we advance, how strong we build, or how loud we shout, war always ends the same way, with silence, and with the whisper of the Somme beneath our feet, reminding us that every shot fired in anger echoes forever. Chapter 14. The Fields of Memory. The Somme in the Modern Age, 1940, present day. When the Second World War came and went, the guns fell silent once again over Europe. The cities burned, the empires crumbled, and the world rebuilt itself from ashes, just as it had after the Somme. But even as the world entered a new age of speed, light, and technology, the ghosts of that first great battlefield refused to fade. The Somme endured, not as a scar now, but as a mirror, reflecting humanity back to itself. It was a place where the past and present overlapped, where the silence spoke louder than any monument, and where the earth still remembered everything that had been done upon it. After 1945, the fields of northern France looked peaceful again. The grass grew thick, the rivers shimmered, and the sky above the Thiepval Ridge was once more open and blue. Farmers worked their lands as their grandfathers had before the war, plowing through the soil that still held fragments of the dead. Every spring, the plows struck rusted helmets, broken rifles, and bones, white and fragile as porcelain. These were called the Iron Harvest, a grim reminder that the Somme never truly let go of its dead. The locals gathered what they found and handed them to the authorities, who placed the remains in collective graves, unmarked but honored. To this day, New bones are uncovered every year, and each discovery reopens a story that had been left unfinished a century before. The Thiepval Memorial stood firm through the Second War. Nazi soldiers marched past it during their occupation of France, but even they did not destroy it. They understood, perhaps, that it was not a monument of victory, but of death, something beyond politics, beyond even their cruelty. When the war ended, the Thiepval Arch was repaired, cleaned, and restored, its 72,000 names gleaming once more under the pale French sun. Visitors returned, this time not just from Britain and France, but from all over the world. Canadians, Australians, Indians, South Africans, descendants of men who had fought side by side in the mud of 1916, came to see the place where their history had been written in blood. The post-war generation saw the Somme through new eyes. They had lived through another global catastrophe, another cycle of destruction and rebirth. To them, the First World War was no longer the Great War, but the beginning of the modern nightmare. And yet, amid the horror, they also saw something sacred, a kind of resilience that refused to die. The men who fought there were not symbols of glory anymore. They were symbols of humanity's endurance, of the ordinary courage that allows civilization to rebuild after every collapse. The Somme had become more than a battlefield. It was a lesson carved into the earth. As the decades passed, the memorials multiplied. Every nation that had fought on the Somme built its own, some grand, others simple, but all united by silence. The Beaumont Hamel, Newfoundland Memorial, with its stone caribou overlooking the valley where an entire regiment had been wiped out in minutes, became a place of pilgrimage. The Lac Nagar crater, a vast wound still visible in the ground, filled with rainwater and wildflowers, stood as a reminder of the explosions that had once torn the sky apart. The cemetery spread across the countryside like white pearls on green cloth. Sarah Road, Delville Wood, Caterpillar Valley, Posiers, and so many more. Each one meticulously tended, each one whispering the same story, that youth, courage, and innocence had once walked here, and that they had not been forgotten. By the 1960s, the last veterans of the Somme were old men. Their bodies were frail, their voices quiet, but their memories burned undimmed. They returned to France one last time, to stand among the graves of their fallen comrades. Some came in wheelchairs, others with canes. They walked the paths where their trenches had been, though now there were only lines of trees and faint depressions in the earth. They touched the names on the memorial walls, their fingers trembling, and they wept, not for themselves, but for the boys who had never grown old. "It's quiet now," one veteran said softly, standing on the ridge at Thiepval, "but it still feels alive. You can feel them here." As the 20th century marched on, the Somme became a place of pilgrimage not only for families and soldiers, but for students, historians, and travelers seeking to understand what humanity had done to itself. Schools brought children to walk the old trenches, to stand in the shell craters, to learn that war was not a painting of heroism, but a tapestry of pain. Guides told stories of the first day, 19,000 dead before noon, and the children listened in stunned silence, unable to grasp how numbers so large could represent real people. They walked among the graves and noticed the ages, 19, 20, 21. Some whispered, they were just like us. That realization, more than any book or speech, carried the true message of the Somme forward into the future. The 1970s and 1980s saw the rise of remembrance as a ritual woven into the fabric of nations. On every Armistice Day, the fields of the Somme filled with visitors. Politicians stood beside school children, veterans beside teenagers, as the last post echoed across the valleys. The red poppy became the universal symbol of memory, blooming not only in France, but in Britain, Canada, Australia, and beyond. For some, it was a sign of respect. For others, it was a warning, a reminder that peace was never guaranteed, that civilization itself was fragile. But as time passed, the survivors disappeared. One by one, the men who had fought at the Somme left the world, until only photographs and recordings remained. The last British veteran of the First World War, Harry Patch, died in 2009 at the age of 111. He had fought at Passchendaele, but the Somme was part of his memory too. In one of his final interviews, he said, "War isn't worth one life. It's the devil's playground. We learned that once, but we forgot." His words echoed the warning of every man who had seen that field of death and lived to tell about it. The Somme had been the grave of millions, but also the birthplace of truth, the truth that no victory can ever erase the cost of war. As the 21st century dawned, the Somme remained as it always had, quiet, beautiful, and haunted. Technology changed, politics changed, the world grew smaller, but the field stayed the same. On clear mornings, mist rolled through the valleys, just as it had in 1916. The dew settled on the rows of white stones, glistening like tears. The birds sang, the church bells rang from distant villages, and beneath the earth, the dead slept in their eternal ranks. Tourists walked the trails, guided by maps and signs marking where battalions had once stood. They took photographs and left poppies, sometimes without truly understanding what they were standing on. But the land knew. The land remembered. Each generation has tried to find its own meaning in the Somme. For some, it is a warning about the futility of war. For others, it is a testament to courage and endurance. For many, it is both, a place where the worst and best of humanity exist side by side. The soldiers who fought there are long gone, but their presence endures in the stillness of the air, in the rhythm of the wind, in the weight of silence that falls whenever a visitor stops to listen. There is a strange peace there now, not the peace of victory, but the peace of reconciliation. The British and Germans who once killed each other now stand together each year in remembrance ceremonies. The children of both sides lay wreaths together, their hands brushing as they set the flowers down. It is a quiet act, but a powerful one. It says that memory can heal, even if the scars never vanish. In the digital age, the Somme has found new life. Drone footage shows the vast sweep of the old battlefield, its ridges and craters still visible beneath the fields of wheat. Virtual tours allow students across the world to walk its trenches without leaving their classrooms. Documentaries, films, and novels continue to tell its story, each generation rediscovering it in their own way. Yet no photograph or screen can truly capture the feeling of standing there in person. The chill of the wind, the whisper of the grass, the sense that beneath your feet lies the weight of a million lives. The Somme resists being turned into history. It is not the past. It is the ever-present echo of what happens when humanity forgets its own limits. The farmers who live there today still talk of the ghosts. They say that on certain foggy mornings, when the mist hangs low and the air smells of earth and rain, they hear sounds that have no source. The faint rattle of distant gunfire, the whistle of shells, the soft murmur of voices calling across the fields. They do not fear it. They respect it. They understand that their land holds not just soil, but memory, the memories of young men who came from far away and never left. On the centenary of the Battle of the Somme, in 2016, thousands gathered again. They came from Britain, France, Canada, Australia, Germany, India, South Africa, from every corner of the world that had been touched by that terrible summer. They stood in silence at dawn, as the first light broke over the horizon, just as it had on July 1st, 1916. The wind moved through the poppies, and for a moment, it was as if the past and present were one. No guns, no thunder, only remembrance. The speeches were brief. The silence was longer. Some wept, others bowed their heads. And when the last post was played, its notes carried across the valley, fading slowly into the distance, like the sound of history itself disappearing into the mist. Today, the Somme is more than a place. It is a lesson that belongs to all of humanity. It stands as proof that progress without compassion leads only to ruin, that technology cannot save us from ourselves, and that the cost of pride is always measured in lives. It reminds us that peace is not something given, but something built, carefully, deliberately, and with humility. The soldiers who died there may never have known why they fought, but in their suffering, they left behind a truth that endures, that every generation must remember, or it will be forced to learn again. If you visit the Somme now, you will find no trace of anger. The rivers are calm, the air is still, and the fields stretch wide beneath the sun. But listen long enough, and you will hear the faint sound of the wind moving through the poppies, a sound that is both mournful and gentle, like a voice from another time whispering a final prayer. It is the sound of a world that learned, at terrible cost, what it means to forget. The Battle of the Somme ended more than a century ago, yet it continues to speak to us, quietly but persistently, reminding us of what we are capable of, both in cruelty and in compassion. The white stones gleam against the green, row after row, endless, perfect. Each one holds a story, a name, a fragment of life cut short. Together, they form a chorus of silence, one that says more than any speech ever could. The Somme does not accuse. It does not glorify. It simply remembers. And so it endures, not as a monument of war, but as a monument of humanity. It tells us that memory is our only defense against repetition, that to forget is to risk becoming what we once were. It teaches us that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of remembrance. And as long as the poppies bloom in those fields, as long as the wind moves through the grass and the names on the stones remain, the Somme will continue to whisper, softly, eternally, never again. Chapter 15. The Eternal Silence, the Somme and the Human Condition. There are places on this earth where time seems to stop, where the wind carries the weight of centuries, and where the silence feels alive. The Somme is one of those places. More than 100 years have passed since the guns fell quiet, yet the land still remembers. It remembers the thunder, the fear, the courage, and the despair. It remembers the moment when an entire generation was consumed by the machinery of war. But beyond the statistics, beyond the monuments and the history books, the Somme has become something greater, a mirror held up to humanity, showing us who we are and what we can become when the line between progress and destruction disappears. If you stand on the Thiepval Ridge at dawn, the light comes slow and soft, spilling across the fields like a whisper. The poppies tremble in the wind, the grass sways, and the air smells of earth and memory. The valleys stretch outward, peaceful now, their scars hidden beneath a blanket of green. It's hard to believe that this calm place was once the scene of chaos, where every inch of ground was fought over, and every sunrise brought another avalanche of death. And yet, beneath that stillness, something stirs, a heartbeat in the soil, the pulse of history that refuses to fade. The Somme is quiet now, but it is not silent. Its silence speaks. The men who died here were ordinary souls caught in extraordinary circumstances. They were farmers, miners, students, clerks, teachers. They came from every corner of Britain and the Empire, carrying photographs of sweethearts and letters from home. They believed, as so many before them had, that their sacrifice would end war forever. Instead, they became the first citizens of the modern world, a world built on the ruins of faith, where machines and men became indistinguishable in their purpose. The Somme was not just a battlefield, it was a birth. Out of its horror came the century that followed, the century of speed, of cities, of industry, of endless noise. The world that emerged was faster, more connected, more powerful, but also more haunted. The ghosts of the Somme walked beside it, unseen but always there. After the battle ended, after the war itself faded into memory, humanity stood on the threshold of something new. The lessons of the Somme were written in pain, but few were ready to read them. The idea that human progress could destroy as easily as it created, that civilization's brilliance could turn inward and consume itself, was a truth too terrible to accept. The people who lived through it wanted to believe it had been an aberration, a mistake. They built memorials, they sang hymns, they promised it would never happen again. And yet, history moved forward as if it had learned nothing. Within a generation, the world returned to war. The thunder came back, louder this time, and the sky once again turned black with smoke. But even after the Second War ended, even after the Cold War dawned and nuclear fire replaced machine guns, the Somme remained a reminder of how quickly civilization can unravel. Its story outlasted every ideology and every empire. It outlasted kings and dictators, revolutions and reunifications. The trenches crumbled, but the idea of what they represented, the sheer capacity of humanity to destroy itself, never left. And yet, within that darkness, there was something else. The proof that even in the face of annihilation, the human spirit endures. The Somme was not only a place of death. It was also a place of defiance. The soldiers who fought there lived in conditions no human being should have endured, yet they still found ways to laugh, to write poetry, to sing songs in the mud. They shared cigarettes, told stories, and helped the wounded even when the next shell could have taken them both. In that inferno, humanity's smallest gestures, a cup of tea, a shared joke, a photograph passed from hand to hand, became acts of resistance. These moments are what make the Somme unforgettable. It was not just a story of loss, but of compassion surviving in the most inhuman of places. It reminds us that no matter how deep the darkness, there is always something worth holding on to. The Somme's silence is not empty. It is full of voices, of memories, of questions that humanity still struggles to answer. What drives men to kill on such a scale? What compels nations to feed their youth into the furnace of ambition and pride? And why, after every war, do we promise to remember, only to forget? Perhaps that is why the Somme endures, because it is not just a historical site, but a moral landscape. It forces us to confront the truth that progress and destruction are twins born of the same human hand. It asks whether we have truly evolved since the guns stopped firing, or if we are simply waiting for the next spark to ignite the same old fire. The modern world is full of noise, constant, relentless, deafening. News, engines, politics, technology, voices shouting across digital battlefields. It is easy to forget, in all this clamor, that there was once a time when the only sound that mattered was silence, the silence that followed the end of a bombardment, when the living counted the dead. The men of the Somme did not have the luxury of distraction. They faced reality stripped of illusion. They saw what happens when the human race loses itself in the pursuit of power, when war ceases to be a failure of politics and becomes an industry. And that knowledge, terrible as it was, became the foundation of the world that followed. Every age since the Somme has found its reflection there. In every conflict, from Korea to Vietnam, from Bosnia to Iraq, the lessons echo. The technology changes, the uniforms change, the flags change, but the essence remains the same. The mud, the waiting, the fear, the courage, the loss. The Somme was the template for the modern battlefield. Its trenches became the DNA of every war that followed, and its ghosts followed those who fought long after. It is no exaggeration to say that the 20th century began in 1916, not with invention, but with destruction. The Somme was humanity's first glimpse of its own potential for annihilation. Yet despite that, people still come. Every year, they walk the fields, lay flowers, and stand in silence. They come not just to honor the dead, but to understand them. The Somme is not a place of glory. It is a place of empathy. When you stand among the white stones and read the names, the same names carved thousands of times across 1,000 memorials, you feel the weight of what was lost. Each stone represents not just a life, but an entire future that never came to be, a family that was never born, a dream that was never realized, a voice that was silenced before it could sing. The Somme reminds us that history is not made by generals or kings, but by those who endure it. As the century turned and the last veterans faded into history, the Somme transformed once again. It became less a symbol of war and more a meditation on the nature of memory itself. Humanity, it seems, is doomed to repeat what it refuses to confront. The world still wages wars, still invents new weapons, still sends young men and women to die in causes they barely understand. But the psalm remains, whispering across the decades. Remember what happens when you stop seeing each other as human. Remember what happens when progress becomes a god and empathy a casualty. Remember the mud, the noise, the darkness, and remember that it was all once called the war to end all wars. The lesson of the psalm is not that war is evil. That has always been known. Its true lesson is that war is seductive. It feeds on pride, on patriotism, on the illusion of control. The soldiers who died did not go to war because they were monsters. They went because they believed they were doing what was right. The psalm reminds us that the line between good intentions and catastrophe is terrifyingly thin. It shows us that humanity's greatest danger has never been hatred. It has been faith without reflection, conviction without doubt, progress without morality. Today, as the world once again feels uncertain, the psalm stands as a compass pointing toward humility. It teaches that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding. The men who fought there were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were simply human beings doing their best in impossible circumstances. Their bravery lay not in their willingness to die, but in their refusal to surrender their humanity amid madness. And that, more than anything, is the lesson the psalm offers us. That compassion is the only true victory left to us. When dusk falls on the psalm, the light changes. The fields turn golden, the air cools, and the shadows lengthen across the valleys. The sound of birds fades, and the stillness deepens. It feels as though the world itself is holding its breath, waiting for the night. In that moment, if you listen, you can almost hear them. The faint murmur of voices, the laughter of boys long gone, the rustle of ghosts moving through the grass. They are not haunting this place in sorrow. They are watching, reminding, waiting. They whisper not of death, but of memory. And as the stars rise over the fields, the psalm reveals its final truth, that history never ends. It lives on in us, in every act of kindness or cruelty, in every choice between empathy and indifference. The soldiers who fought there are part of us now, their blood mixed with our earth, their courage written into our story. The silence of the psalm is not an ending. It is a beginning, the sound of humanity listening to itself, perhaps for the first time. So when the wind moves through the poppies and the moonlight falls over the white stones, remember that this place is not just about the past. It is about what we carry forward. The psalm does not belong to history. It belongs to every soul who looks upon it and promises, in their heart, that we will not let it happen again. For as long as those words are spoken, as long as someone stands on that ridge and listens to the silence, the psalm will never truly sleep. It will remain what it has always been, not a monument of war, but a prayer for peace, eternal and unbroken. The psalm story ends where it began, in silence. But this silence is not emptiness. It is full of meaning, full of love, full of warning. It is the voice of humanity itself, reminding us of both our greatest failure and our greatest strength. The guns have been quiet for more than a century, but their echoes live on, not in the sky, but in our hearts. And if you stand there long enough, beneath the same sky those boys once saw, you'll understand what they left behind was not just tragedy, but truth. The psalm is that truth, carved into the earth forever, whispering softly into the wind, teaching us what it means to be human.